welcome to another episode of the Pakistan Experience. We have somebody who's a man of many talents, which people also say about me, and I always respond with, is it because I'm not good at any one particular thing? Is it because I'm mentally ill and I have to distract myself to not think about the crushing sense of reality? So let's try and figure out whether that's a me problem or it's a stand-up comedy problem in general, because Mr. Sami Shah has joined us all the way from Melbourne. How are you, Mr. Sami Shah?
I am good. So you, like myself, are what is it called?
Mentally ill person.
yeah. The way my mom used to describe it is jack of all trades, master of none. Yeah. So that's basically in retrospect, if I just focused on one thing, preferably that one thing being banking or accounting or something, I'd be in a much better place in life right now. But I didn't.
So for people who don't know Mr. Sami Shah, stand-up comedian, author, broadcaster, Pakistani Jon Stewart, who's now transitioned into being Australian Neil Gaiman, fantasy fiction writer.
Yeah, I still do the comedy as well. But I started in Karachi. I started with Blackfish. I don't even know if anyone remembers Blackfish anymore. Yeah,
the improv troupe.
The improv comedy troupe. Saad Haroon started it. And it was Faris Khalid, Saad Haroon, Umar Rana, Sanam Saeed, Ishma Alvi, myself, Cyrus Jahangir. And yeah, we used to do improv. We did from 2002 to 2004, 2005 we did it basically. And then 2005, I did my first solo stand-up comedy show because my ego was so big that I was like, I can't be part of something that's got other people in it. I need to just me on stage alone. I did my first stand-up show, which is an hour, which is crazy now that I think about it, that I literally started with a 1 hour show. And I did it PSCC, I remember, the PSCC auditorium. And yeah, I haven't looked back since.
I think
I've looked back a lot, but yeah.
With much regret.
Yeah.
I think that's Pakistan's problem, right? So even my first show was an hour, because it's not like you can hit an open mic. There were no such thing as comedy open mic nights back then. So it's not like you can build up to an hour. You're like, this is my show, my friends, buy tickets. And I'm so sorry that you had to sit there for an hour. I probably had 5 minutes of material and 55 minutes of wishy-washy stuff.
No, I remember I was really disciplined about it. I spent 6, maybe 8 months just writing alone in a room, rehearsing to a mirror, practicing. And that first hour, I still have video of it. It's, I'm wearing weird jeans and stuff and I'm super skinny, but it's not terrible. There's some good stand-up bits in it. And I was pretty, even now, I'm like, all right, that was not bad. But yeah, it's that, you're right. There's no open mic nights, nothing. I used to have to figure out ways of doing comedy, real weird ways. I did it on Second Life for a while. I did all kinds of weird things just so I could practice. Yeah.
I think it's your first 5 shows are not the problem. It's the next 50. Because the first 5, you're riding on the high. Your friends are there to support you. Everybody's laughing. And you're like, wow, I'm doing a good job. It's when that runs out and then you have to grind out the actual first hour. That's the work.
Well, it's a thing of, I've been doing stand-up comedy now for 15 years. I've done, God knows, thousands of shows at this point. I'm sorry. But the thing that you realize after doing it for a while is I was lucky. My first show was great. The first joke works. The first, there's the whole 1 hour show went well. And you don't learn stand-up comedy by doing well. You learn stand-up comedy when you die on stage, when you really do badly. And I got that very quickly. I remember because the show went well, and then City FM 89 said, hey, should we sponsor you and take you to Islamabad? So I was like, yeah, let's go to Islamabad. So I went to Islamabad to do 2 shows. And my first show in Islamabad was terrible. Just for 1 hour, silence, didn't connect to the audience, came in too strong, all the mistakes you make. And that's probably when I really actually started becoming a stand-up comedian, is learning how to survive a bad gig. And then the next night I did fine. I did really well. In fact, I kind of fine-tuned it and realized I did wrong. But yeah, since then, gigged so much. But you're always learning how to be a stand-up comedian, and you always are a stand-up comedian. It's one of those things.
One of my first Islamabad stand-up comedy shows also has a terrible story. I don't know if you remember Kuch Khas, which used to be...
Yeah, and I remember. Yes. I did shows at Kuch Khas.
So we were sitting at Kuch Khas, and the show is at 8 p.m. and at 6 p.m. we get a call saying, the diplomatic enclave has been broken into by a mob. And then we look up and there's like a couple of helicopters and we're like, uh, we've bought tickets to fly to Islamabad for this show. And then we're sitting
Yeah.
there like, ab kya hoga?
Dude, I don't know what the scene is in Karachi now, but
It's
like,
great.
when I was performing, particularly around 2007, 2008, around that time, like, I don't know if you remember, the terrorist attacks were like
Yes.
an all-time high then, right? This is the Musharaf, the end of the Musharaf era. Benazir Bhutto had just come back, and terror attacks were happening all the time. I had booked a show, I had booked PACC, I'd sold 200, 250 tickets. I was all set up to do a show. And then 2 days before the show, there was Benazir Bhutto had just landed in Karachi after her return from her self-exile. And that was the Karsaz bombing. And I was the journalist working for Dawn News at the time. And I was the guy on the scene. Like I got to there like 5-6 minutes after the Karsaz bombing happened. And I worked there all night as a cameraman and as a producer and all those things. And I remember like thinking, and it's just a very selfish thought to have, but I remember thinking, I need to cancel the show. Obviously, just 100 something people have just died in Karachi, and it's a horrific thing. We don't know if we're safe. And then a part of me just went, you know what? This is bullshit. Like, this keeps happening every time. Like, every time Blackfish, we've been doing that for ages, canceling shows because of terror attacks, because security threats and bomb threats. And I was like, it's not fair. Like, all we want to do is sit in a room and laugh, and we can't even do that. So I didn't cancel the show. And I remember 200 people came, and I did like probably the first show in which I've kind of figured out my voice, which is I'm not an observational comedian. I talk about some really dark things and stuff. And that was the show where it kind of all gelled together and the people really laughed and stuff. And I remember that moment of like, man, how do you do comedy like this? And you just do it. I remember we kept doing it. Now it seems like it's a lot better. I haven't been back in 7 years, 8 years now, but seems like it's a lot better. What's the comedy scene there like now? Like, how many comedians are there?
It's phenomenal. We will get into this, but there are a couple of threads I want to pull up out of what you said. I forgot
Okay.
exactly who said it, but some comics said the first time New York recovered after 9/11 was when the first time somebody cracked a joke about 9/11 at a comedy club in New York and somebody laughed. And I went to Madison Square
Yeah.
Garden, and now it's pretty contentious to talk about Louis C.K. But back then he wasn't problematic, or at least people didn't know he was problematic.
Yeah.
And he did a 15-minute bit on 9/11, and it was hilarious. And Madison Square
Yeah.
Garden, 30,000
Yeah.
people were laughing at it. And I'm like, this is what catharsis looks like. A lot of times in Pakistan, especially, we look down upon comedy, but comedy as catharsis is
Well,
how people recover.
I don't think we look down. Okay, I don't know. Maybe now we look down at it. But I remember, like, because I remember one of the things that when I came to Australia, or I did, even when I was in Pakistan and I did shows for the BBC and stuff, they used to always go, "Oh, is there comedy in Pakistan?" And I used to always be like, "Yeah, like we've got a strong, rich history of comedy." We're not because like what people compare Pakistan to, unfortunately, is the Arab countries, right?
Yes.
The Arab countries don't have a history of comedy the way we do, right? They didn't grow up on 50-50 and like Anwar Maqsood and Moin Akhtar and all these things. And what we have is every time, I remember working like in 2008, 2009, particularly probably the darkest times I've ever worked in Pakistan. I live in Pakistan. The jokes were thick and fast, and right after something bad would happen because it's a coping mechanism. We always had that. I think that's a very Pakistani thing. I remember meeting Indian comedians a few years ago, and they used to say, like, they used to envy our sense of humor because they'd watch 50-50 and Tanhaiya and all these shows from Pakistan, and they'd be like, man, it's so funny, but it's so dark. And that was our thing. We would process trauma through comedy. And that was a Desi thing to do, that a Pakistani thing to do. And I always took pride in that. The fact that, like, no matter what happens, no matter how bad it gets, if you can, that equation that you have in comedy, it's tragedy plus time equals comedy. And I believe in Pakistani and in Pakistanis that tragedy plus time, you can basically take out the time because it's literally tragedy equals comedy for us. Like, that's just how we deal with things.
Brilliant. It's maybe a recent phenomena because a lot of my research is also on theater history, and we look at, if we even go back further and we look at the actual Bhand culture, which has now been bastardized in the form of these stage shows, it was a lot of social subversion. It was a lot of social subversion. The only people actually making fun of Musharaf initially were these bhands, were people like Amanullah and Amanat Chand. They were the ones going to places
Yes.
making fun of a military dictator. And even if you trace it way back during the British colonial era, you know, like if you've seen these stage shows, there's a constant joke about a character who can't speak English. Or even if you mention 50-50, there's a sketch called Janu German. That entire
Remember.
joke about mocking the fact that we speak English incorrectly comes from the Bhand culture. It's like the colonizers have invaded and they've taken all of our power. The only power I have is that I can mock the fact that I can't speak your language. And
Yeah.
it's such a powerful social subversion tool. Maybe right now, because of social media, that sensitization argument gets thrown into comedians' faces, especially a lot. But people don't realize it's coming. You're cracking this joke because it's catharsis.
Well, I think what happens is people go after comedians. People have come after me many times, and they've gone after other comedians I know and I've worked with, and you know, globally it happens. In Pakistan, it happens a lot. I think people come after comedians because we're the easy target, right? You can't lose by going after comedians. Comedians don't have gangs that are going to go after you in return. Comedians can't turn around and threaten you. Like, we are literally, you know, the lowest in terms of power and influence and all of that stuff. And so, and also because of the nature of what we do, we're the ones the furthest out there, right? We are saying the things no one else will say. We're thinking the things no one else will think, or people think but don't want to say, because comedy comes from shock. Comedy comes from surprise. And to shock and surprise, sometimes you have to go to uncomfortable places. So what ends up happening a lot is a comedian something bad will happen. There are people responsible for that. Terrorists are responsible for that. Politicians are responsible for that. The military is responsible for that. You can't do anything against them. You're powerless, right? You've got nothing. But a comedian will make a joke and you're like, well, I can kick his bum. Like, I can hurt him because he's got no power. How dare you say that? You're canceled. To hell with you. You're insensitive. All those things. And they'll shut down the comedian. And it's because it's an easy target that lacks the power to fight back. The only tools a comedian has to fight back are satire, are making fun of you, which a lot of people are scared of. You know, the first thing that people censor whenever someone is censorious, like a government or anything, is satire, because the truth can die tomorrow, but the satire lives on forever. You know, so it's always that kind of a thing.
It's also that there's so much consciousness now about even things getting lost in translation, whereas comedy, when you write it down, it's not even the same thing. It's like an event.
Doesn't work.
It's like a cricket match happening in your gully, and you take a picture and you post it online, and somehow that picture encapsulates everything that happened for 2 hours. If you stand up on stage and crack a joke and somebody prints that, or somebody puts it on Twitter saying Shazad joked about having anal sex with a woman, and I'm like, what was the context? What happened before that? What happened after that? If you phrase it like that, if you write it down like I meant it, without the tonality, without the context, without people laughing at that so that the tension is released, and not, right now it's in text form on Twitter, it's not even the same thing.
Yeah, it does. Because it's like going to a concert. You know, even if you go to a Junoon concert, or, you know, back in the day, and that's what Junoon used to get in trouble with. People would take their lyrics and just show the lyrics to politicians or to mullahs or whatever and be like, look at what they're singing about. Because it's not, if you're reading it, it'll sound scandalous. If you're reading it, it'll sound revolutionary. But if you're in the moment and you hear the music and you hear the drums and you hear the guitars and you see the people rocking out and everything, that's the context of it. It works like stand-up comedy is the same thing. Comedy is the same thing. It's meant to be performed. You know, I write comedy as well. I write columns for newspapers that are satirical. I've done that for years, and that's meant to be read. And so I write it a certain way, you know, like you can't, but even there, if you take one sentence out of a paragraph and you're like, that sentence is terrible. Yes, the sentence is terrible, but the paragraph is the context around it. And so it's the same thing with stand-up comedy. The stage, the audience, the laughter, everything is the setup, the punchline, the callback. That's the context.
It's even there, it's the same thing, right? Because I also write a lot of satire, and sometimes people take it seriously. I wrote a satirical article about how men need a Mard March for our rights. Now, if you just say Shahzad said men need a Mard March for their rights, I sound like a men's rights activist.
Yeah. Yeah.
But read at the absurdity around that. Look at the point that I'm making.
I remember when I used to write for Express Tribune way back when it first started, like way back in the day. And one of the columns I wrote at the time was there had been a flood in Sindh, a lot of people had died, and the government hadn't done anything, right? Like there'd been barely any resources put in. We'd had flood warnings for weeks leading up to the flood. No one paid attention. Lots of people suffered because of it. And the response was the government said, okay, we've got people. I remember this. They put like 2010, maybe 2011. They put people at traffic lights with boxes in which you could donate money. And there was going to, all the money that they put into that boxes would be collected and used for flood relief. And I wrote a column in which I was basically the point of view of a government employee who's going, I don't care about the people who died. I don't care about their suffering. I would climb over their dead bodies because it helps my career and for no other reason, right? Like that kind of audacious, crazy thing. Like the kind of thing that like Jonathan Swift wrote in England in the late 1700s about like the Irish should eat their babies, which was a satirical reference about like Irish poverty. And I was doing that. And most people got it. Most people did get it. And I remember at the time, a lot of people wrote and said, hey, thank you for kind of crystallizing our anger at the government. But I remember a few people wrote and said, how can you say such a thing? You're a monster. You're a horrible person. Luckily, this is before social media really took over our lives. But, I was like, how is it not obvious that this is not, like, this is satire? What kind of psychopath would write this essay and publish it in a newspaper? And now you look around and you see like the people who actually publish opinions.
Our fellow countrymen.
Okay, yeah. Exactly.
I think that's the problem. So I stopped writing satire, and a lot of you are like, why your column stopped? It's because I can't think of anything crazier than what is happening right now. I wrote a piece when they rejected the Women's Protection Bill. I wrote a piece saying, I think we need a Men's Protection Bill. 3 months later, the Council of Islamic Ideology suggested a Men's Protection Bill.
Jesus.
My God. In my head, I thought of the most crazy thing. And you've done something crazier than what I thought. I wrote a piece about how Homeland accurately portrayed Pakistan. People thought that I was being serious. So I was like, this world is crazier than my imagination.
Yeah. You're not the first comedian to think that in the last few years, and you're not going to be the last.
Especially in Pakistan, because sometimes you hear people and they're being serious, like a legit discussion. And I'm going to be careful about saying these things because I think a lot of your Australian audience will also listen to this and they might think this is all that Pakistan is. Absolutely not.
No, of course
not. Multicultural country, but these things also unfortunately exist. We seriously have discussions on national TV about whether it's okay to lightly beat a woman. If it's your wife, as long as you lightly beat her, that's fine. That was a legit discussion point.
So I just finished this column. I just submitted. There's a newspaper here called the Saturday Paper, and I write a weekly satire column for them, right? Where I make fun of the local news stories, the top news stories. In the last 2 weeks, the top news story in Australia, the last 2-3 weeks now, has been there was a woman a woman interning at Parliament House here in Canberra in the government. And she, a couple of years ago, and a guy who she was working with got her drunk and then allegedly raped her, right? People in the government knew it happened. They didn't do anything. They actively discouraged her from, making court case out of it. They basically, and the guy was never punished for it. She finally, 2 years later, said, had enough. And she said, this is the thing that happened to me. The government tried to pretend like it didn't happen. Hopefully this whole story can be ignored, and they just kind of poo-pooed it away. But the story kept building momentum. More and more stories kept coming out. And then another woman, it turned out, had accused the Attorney General of Australia of raping her in the 1980s. She had been making this case for years. People had been ignoring it, neglecting it, not telling. That finally came out to the media. As a result, thousands and thousands of women across the country decided enough's enough, and they marched. So they did an Aurat march, like we, in Pakistan, and it's called March for Justice. It just happened on the 4th of March. It just happened 2 days ago, in fact, this week. And it was a march across Australia, women marching in thousands of numbers. And the Prime Minister's response was, well, they should be grateful because in other countries, you shoot people for marching. Right? Now, this is Australia, the quote-unquote Western democracy, liberal democracy, all that stuff. While I was reading this and watching this unfold here, I've got a Twitter feed and I've got the social media news feed, and I see news from Pakistan and news from Australia. And in Pakistan, the Aurat March is just finished. And the response to the Aurat March isn't, yes, these women are right. It is, oh, these women are committing blasphemy and we must now kill them for this. It is, oh, women are targeting men, which, by the way, some Australian politicians also said about the women's march here that, oh, why are they making men look bad, not all men. And then, meanwhile, the Misha Shafi case against Ali Zafar, where Ali Zafar is suing Misha Shafi for damaging his reputation. The Daily Mail runs an article about that, which destroys Misha Shafi's reputation even further instead of helping her. Meanwhile, in Australia, the Attorney General, who allegedly raped someone in the 1980s, has launched a court case against the news channels here for destroying his reputation as opposed to investigating the rape. So they're identical stories, literally identical stories about rape, sexual assault, sexual abuse, harassment, women marching for change, governments ignoring and neglecting them, happening side by side in both countries. So my column, and my column's based in Australia, it's for an Australian audience. I started by saying, there are women, thousands of women are marching because of sexual assault, sexual harassment. A woman who tried prosecuting someone for sexual harassment is now being taken to court herself for this thing because the man's reputation is more important. Oh, I'm not talking about Australia, I'm talking about Pakistan. But the Pakistani Prime Minister's response, still not as bad as the Australian Prime Minister's response, like just kind of drawing that comparison between the two. So that issue of women's rights, women's live, nobody, it turns out, can claim superiority over, because conservative governments, right-wing governments everywhere in the world are just as regressive, just as misogynistic, just as patriarchal.
I think when it comes to women's rights, yes, all men. I think men all around the world. People continue benefiting of patriarchy and the status quo. Going back to that Benazir moment, you were there. You reached the scene right after.
I reached like 7 minutes after the second blast. I was stationed at Qaid's Mazar, and we had another journalist, reporter, Aftab Borka, who's a very good friend of mine, and now he lives in America. Him and a cameraman were at the site where the blast explosion happened. The cameraman lost his leg, I remember, in the explosion, and Aftab disappeared for a while. So I got the call as soon as the explosion happened saying, there's been a bomb blast, get there now. And so it was myself, my cameraman, my ad reporter with me. I was a news producer at the time. We jumped into the van. We went from Qaid's Mazar straight to like literally empty streets. And this is like all day long, the streets had been packed to the max. Suddenly the streets are empty. Got there like 7-8 minutes later. I'll never forget the things I saw that day. I will never forget the amount of body parts and death and just suffering that I saw that day. And we found the cameraman, we put him in an ED ambulance. We found my reporter who was traumatized and shell-shocked because he had just missed the blast by a few seconds. And for, I think, a year or two after that, he wouldn't go into crowded spaces. Like, he was too traumatized by that. And then I did reporting there till like 2-3 o'clock in the morning. And then I went home, everything covered in blood from my top to bottom, neck to ankles, basically. And then the next day you went back to work. Because it's Pakistan, man. There's no one's got time for trauma or PTSD or any of those things. Just get you back to dawn news and you get back to work.
So funny you say I will never forget that, but I was listening to an interview of yours where you said you had repressed a memory for a decade.
So here's what I had not, like, what I did was, I didn't think that it was a big deal. Because part of, like, especially being a journalist in Karachi, was always this thing of, like, we were trained and worked with older journalists who'd seen everything. Guys who had been journalists and reporters during the 1980s MQM, PPP wars, gang wars and all that. So 1990s, sorry. gang wars and all that stuff. And they, like they'd seen all kinds of stuff. And everyone, it was very much a thing of like, if you're going to be traumatized, you shouldn't be in this business. Toughen up, get your stuff together, be a man, And so it was that kind of attitude. And so I didn't think it was a problem. I was like, yeah, I saw about a lot of dead bodies, and I saw, all kinds of disgusting, horrific things. I saw a man's lungs on fire, and that's just what it is. That's the job, and I got on with my job. And I remember a few years later, I was at home in Karachi watching, my brother was watching the Sylvester Stallone movie, Rambo 6, or whatever the most recent one was. When he went to Myanmar, when he went to Burma? Anyway, he goes to Burma and they went really hardcore with the violence, right? So he's like shooting people and they're exploding, blood everywhere, like chunks of flesh flying everywhere. And I started sweating, my hands started shaking, my mouth went dry. I had to sit down. I started getting dizzy, lightheaded. And I was like, what the hell is happening? And I was like, oh, the violence was so realistic in that, so graphic in that. It took me back to the Benazir, the Karsaz blast. And that's the first time where I was like, oh, that's not good. Like, I've obviously got, memories and stuff. And even then, I didn't really have access to a psychologist or psychiatrist or anything, but at least I acknowledged at the time that, yeah, I've got, trauma from that. And then you do what you can. Like the way I processed it was I wrote about it. I put it into a book, and that helped me kind of get it out of my system.
So this happens, and 2 days later, you get on stage on PACC and do an hour of comedy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then people wonder why comedians are mentally unhealthy. Why?
Or is that the only healthy response, man? Who knows? And the world's crazy. Why not? Like, maybe the Joker in Batman is the only guy who makes sense. When there's a man in the bat costume flying around, maybe the only thing you can do to make sense out of it all is put on a Joker face and go and poison the water system.
Was this always you? Was comedy as a coping mechanism always a part of your life as a child, as a kid?
It wasn't a coping mechanism. I think it was just, comedy just been something I've always loved. Honestly, the first time I remember noticing comedy was I was 6 years old probably or something. And we were at a wedding. And the people who were getting married were very rich. And so they had hired Moin Akhtar to do a stage thing. And he was doing, comedy there. Like, now in retrospect, as a professional comedian, I'm like, oh my God, wedding gig. Like, poor Moin Akhtar, what a nightmare. But
if any comedian can pull that off, it's probably Moin Akhtar.
Yeah. And he did. He destroyed. He was amazing. Everyone was laughing. And I remember sitting there in awe, just looking at him going, wow. There's so many people here, and he's got all of them listening to every word, laughing whenever he wants. And I was like, that's amazing. And so I kind of really got into comedy after that. Omar Sharif and, what's it called? Bushra Ansari, all these people. And then you kind of discover stand-up comedy, American style stand-up comedy, because Sangeeta video parlor in Mohammed Society used to get copies of Eddie Murphy's Raw and Eddie Murphy's Delirious, and I watched it on loop again and again and again and again until I memerized every line. And yeah, it just was a thing. Goonie Goo Goo, that's right. Goonie Goo Goo Goo. I got my ice cream. You know what's funny?
Well, that's my favorite bit. So I taught a class of stand-up comedy. That was the bit. I was like, this is the perfect bit.
My daughter's 11 years old right now, and I made her listen to that. I got my ice cream bit, and when Eddie Murphy does the bit about his mom using shoes to like throw at the kids. And she was laughing so hard. She's crying. She's watched it so many times. She's memorized it as well. And I was like, oh my God, I damaged her. She's going to be a comedian.
You do realize she's now going to go and watch the entire Delirious and come back to me and be like, what is Mr. T doing with that nice man's ass? Hey, boy.
Yeah, look, she's grown up in a world with the internet. At some point, I know I can't protect her.
Yeah, maybe 11 is not the age to introduce Delirious.
Maybe. But that's when we watched that stuff, right? If you think about it, like when we grew up, okay, there's a movie called The Deer Hunter. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a classic movie. Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, and really dark, and people, Vietnam War movie, people die in it violently. Dude, when we were kids, no one cared about PG-13 or what's good for. My mom and dad watched it because they watched it. I watched it, and I was like in a 10 or 11-year-old. I was traumatized, lying in bed crying all night, going, "Why did Robert De Niro die?" Like, like it was a very different approach to parenting in retrospect.
But so when I look at your generation and the generation before, there's a lot of this unresolved trauma that people live with, and it comes out in different ways. So, like people who grew up during Zia, people who grew up during uh, the PPP MQM wars, and now the terrorist bomb. This attitude of we just live with it, but you don't really live with it. It just either comes out in anger, and especially in Pakistan,
Mm.
we've never really resolved any trauma, whether it be the trauma of partition. We can't even think about partition as a negative thing. We can't even have a moment of silence for all the millions of people who've lost their lives. It manifests itself in different ways, and a lot of our issues that we see right now, a lot of these angry old men who want to kill everybody or want to give fatwas, I think it's a lot of this unresolved trauma. Had they dealt with it at the right age, maybe we'd
Yeah.
be a country.
It's that that thing that's we talk about now, toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
It's that I remember. I don't know, like my friends and I didn't cry. If we wanted to cry, we definitely didn't cry in front of each other. Um, it took me a long time. It took me until, to be very honest, early last year before I really got comfortable with being able to cry as a man. That's not good. That's the stuff that leads to heart diseases and tumors. Like, um, you just don't. I remember when the attack happened on that army school for the kids.
APS.
Yeah, the APLC attack. I I remember hearing about it. I was in Australia at the time. I used to drive. I used to live in a town outside Perth in Western Australia for a few years, for 3-4 years, and I used to have to drive 2 hours through like basically country roads to get to Perth to do comedy shows every night. And 2 hours there, 2 hours back, and I was driving there, and I just pulled over, and I just started crying. And the thing that made me cry was there's a journalist, Wajahat Khan, and Waj used to be a really good friend of mine when we worked together at Dawn News. And Waj is like an alpha male guy, like
Yeah. Kind of
yeah.
ironic that his nickname is Vaj, but
But yes, look, he'll kill you. I'm not a part of this joke, but like he's like, his voice is deep and he's a big guy with big testosterone and all of those things. And the picture I saw was him in one of those classrooms that had been blown to bits, gunned to bits, bullet holes all against the chalkboard, and him crouched in the corner crying. And seeing that broke me, and I cried. And I was like, I wonder how many people are openly crying right now in Pakistan. And I know it's not many. I know, like, how many people just push that anger down. How many of them do that? I know, I remember, like, when I used to come back from Australia to Pakistan, my friends would ask me, what's the biggest difference? I was like, there's a billion differences. The biggest difference is the moment you walk out of the airport in Karachi, your body clenches like a fist, because you are ready to fight with anyone because they are ready to fight with you. And that's not good. That's not the way people are meant to live. It's exhausting. It wears you down. I still talk to my parents every day in Pakistan, and every day it's my dad is fighting with the pani wala, and then the bijli wala, and then the this, and my mom is fighting with their co-workers, and the this and the that, and the relatives, and you're just like, that's the one thing we need to fix. We need to stop being so angry as a people. But how do you do that? Who knows where you even start? Maybe laughter would be a good thing, but it turns out that's also dangerous.
But that's exactly what the unresolved trauma does to you, right? So, for instance, it's very clear to us. Every 9/11, a lot of people make that point that yes, a lot of Americans died, and it's sad, but a lot of Iraqis and Afghanis also died unnecessarily. We make that point quite clearly, and it's because maybe religion is a huge factor, which is why in Pakistan we make that point loudly and proudly. That was our reaction post APS. That was our reaction. People literally wrote, "This is for APS" on bombs, and bombed places after APS. How many schools were bombed after APS? Just because we didn't see those pictures doesn't mean that
Yeah.
did not die. And as a nation, because we don't cope with trauma and those images, we have no idea the damage the news reporting of APS did to the next generation. I remember my friend's child, we were just driving somewhere, and in Karachi there's a guard culture. These giant Vigos have these AK-47s, and they're holding, and every time she would see that, and this is like a 4 or 5 year old child, she would just grab my friend's, who's her dad's hand, like tightly. And I'm like, nobody will even talk about the impact APS had on the minds of so many children who will grow up never learning what they saw and the trauma they had.
Well, part of it is that. The other part that's scary is now that's the normalized line, right? So there's a moment. The best comparison I can think of is in America. So Sandy Hook Elementary School was a school shooting that happened in America. And America had many school shootings before that. Like I studied in America for 4 years. Within my first 6 months in the US, the Columbine High School shooting happened. In Sandy Hook, 28 children died. Like primary school children, little children were shot and killed. And I remember at the time Americans said, if this doesn't change our gun laws, nothing will. And it didn't change the gun laws. It made the gun laws even worse and made it even easier to get guns and all that stuff. And you realize, okay, America's beyond the point of no return. Now there's no fixing things. That, a country that is okay with their children being shot like that is a country that the next time children are killed, the time after children are killed, the time you want to kill children yourself because you're a maniac, it's not a big deal anymore. They normalized that horror. And in Pakistan, it was APS, I think. APS was the moment where everyone, the country, the governments could have said, no more good Taliban, bad Taliban narrative. No more tolerance of extremism, fundamentalism, all of those things. No more of the stuff that has let this happen. And instead, the lesson was, well, this has happened. Let's just continue with what we're doing and make it worse. Let's normalize this. And now, the next time an APS thing happens, the next time a school full of children is shot and killed and blown up and all that, what's going to happen? Nothing, because you've already crossed that line with APS. It's in Roman history, it's called crossing the Rubicon. Once you break through that barrier of the thing that is unforgivable, unthinkable, the line for what is unforgivable and unthinkable moves further and further away. And I think that's what it was.
It's also that these things don't happen in isolation. There are entire industries that benefit from this. You mentioned Sandy Hook. Alex Jones denied Sandy Hook, and Alex Jones is probably the loudest voice, but there were a lot of people who said this is it's a false flag operation. These are all actors. That was a huge QAnon level conspiracy theories, and the only reason probably we remember Sandy Hook is because the students who loved their friends chose to remember their friends. David Pacman, the guy's name, who went to the Senate, who went to the National Assembly, because they haven't forgotten. Mm-hmm. And it's because of the courage of all the survivors of Sandy Hook who kept the movement alive is the reason we still talk about Sandy Hook, whereas there have been so many school shootings. There's a great Onion piece on it. We can do nothing about school shootings, says the only country which still has school shootings.
Yeah, where this thing happens with alarming regularity or something like that. Yeah, that's right. It's the same thing, man. It's the same thing in every... So one of the things I've kind of realized, every country has their version of that line. In America, it's school shootings. In Pakistan, it's terror attacks or bombings. Or maybe it was when Malala got shot. And I remember I wrote a column for Dawn newspaper, I think within 6 hours of Malala being shot, where I said, because at the time, within the first 12 hours, there's a lot of sympathy and outpouring of grief. And I said, Pakistanis do not respect a victim. And they are going to turn on her and they're going to attack her and the conspiracy theories will start. And literally 24 hours later, I was right on all of those accounts. And maybe that was the line that we crossed, where a little girl being shot in the face by the Taliban to us was like, nah, that's a conspiracy. That's when our craziness revealed itself. But every country's got that. In Australia, it's the refugees and asylum seekers. It's the indigenous people and the treatment over here. If you go to Sweden, I'm sure there's something there. If you go to Finland, I'm sure there's something there. If you go to Venezuela or Cuba, there's some. Every country has got a line which shouldn't be crossed, and how it behaves when that line is crossed defines the future of that country. I think right now we're in a place where too many countries are crossing those lines too happily, gleefully, and not considering the long-term consequences.
I think it's also the post-truth era that we live in. Social media muddles reality and creates perspectives and echo chambers a lot more easily than maybe a few
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's there, but, conspiracy theories were always there, man. I remember, we were in school in 9th grade in Karachi in Foundation Public School, and there was a Gora guy who got shot. He was like a tourist or missionary or something.
Is it
And everyone was
Davis
like,
or Daniel Perd?
No, long before them. Long, 1991 or 1990 or something. And it was like, oh, CIA ka banda hai, and we're definitely CIA and all that stuff. And I remember in school, my friends and all of us shaking hands, going, got the guy, like that. And we're 9th graders. And we're celebrating the death of a person because we've been told that he's probably a CIA guy. Probably wasn't, probably was, who knows? Maybe it's not a good thing for 9th graders to be celebrating the murder of another human being. But that's what you normalize.
I think we also forget narratives, right? So you mentioned good Taliban, bad Taliban. That was progress for us because post 9/11 or even pre 9/11, maybe the writing narrative or the popular narrative was good Taliban. Literally, people.
Yeah, there was no bad Taliban.
Talib means student. So if you're against Taliban, you're against students, and you're like, "Sahi baat to sahi keh raha hai, bilkul sahi keh raha hai."
You're anti-education. That's what it is.
You mentioned Australia as well, and I'm not sure what the opinion in Australia is about this, but I believe, was it John Howard or some Australian Prime Minister who went to the assembly and officially apologized for the indigenous genocide, which at least symbolically, I think back, and I think it's a great symbolic gesture.
Not John Howard. It never would have been John Howard. He's a very conservative far-right guy. It was Kevin Rudd. He was the prime minister here, and it's a very famous day. It's called the Sorry Day. It's when he apologized on behalf of white Australia for it's called the stolen generation, when a whole generation of indigenous children were taken away from their parents and raised in white families to whiten them up. By the way, it still happens, but, and probably in larger number now.
At least they're sorry about it. At least now.
Yeah, but basically they said sorry. But that Sorry Day was picking. I've got a lot of really good indigenous friends who are very cynical, serious journalists who say, like, leading up to the day, they were like, yeah, whatever, who cares, nonsense. And when they heard that sorry from Kevin Rudd, who is a more empathetic and sincere politician, they started crying. And that's an amazing thing. If you just consider for a moment when the Aurat March happens, if Imran Khan or someone comes out and just says, I am sorry, I know how bad you have it because you have told me, and we'll try to do things to fix it and improve it. I can't promise you, but I'm so sorry for the hell you have gone through on a daily basis. Can you imagine just a moment of empathy? And here in Australia, the same thing, but it never happens. It never takes place. They will never display a moment of empathy because empathy is seen as weakness in politics. And that's what it is.
Ideally, we should do that to Bangladesh, but Imran Khan ke liye to bar aur bhi niche set hai.
Yeah.
You're following when there's a Hazara genocide happening, and when recently they were murdered brutally.
I work with a lot of Hazara refugees.
Imran Khan came out and said they're blackmailers. They're blackmailing me.
I know. No, I work with a lot of Hazara refugees here in Australia still, and the trauma never ends for them, man. It's just the level of not just, I mean, I grew up a Shia Muslim in Karachi, and I know what it's like to be Shia. The Sipai Sahaba beat up a Julus I was in Murray when I was a kid, when I was a teenager. I've been lathi charged before. I grew up going to majlises wondering when someone on a motorbike, toss a bomb into Mehfil of Khorasan or Mehfil Murtaza, one of those places. And every Shia knows a Shia who's been killed for being Shia. And every Hazara definitely knows another Hazara who's been murdered. And, it's those things that's what the trauma of everyday life is. And you don't talk about it, you don't address it, you don't manage it, and so maybe you laugh about it, who knows?
It's also that, when we look down upon asylum seekers to the extent that Musharaf, I mean, this is probably one of the worst things a Pakistani leader has said, and that's saying something because our leaders have said some terrible things. But Musharaf literally said, Mukhtara Mai ne to gang rape isliye karwaya asylum milne ke liye. Maybe it's just that idea that our lives here are so terrible. How did this person get away? Which is why we hate asylum.
Yeah. I mean, look, there is definitely, so when I work with asylum seekers and refugees and stuff over here, and by the way, like, I'm lucky I'm not one of them. That's the only, like, that I have a great deal of empathy for them because I understand, like, how it was just luck and timing that I didn't come to Australia as a refugee or asylum seeker. I came here on an immigrant visa because it was just luck. But the reason that what happens is their existence reminds Pakistan, for example, or Syria or Iraq or wherever they're coming from, of how badly it treats people, right? And a Hazara refugee is reminding Pakistanis in Pakistan by his very existence that they made life so hell for him that the only option he had to do was leave his homeland where he was born, where generations have lived. And because of the nature of what we are like, we don't instead go, oh my God, I need to change. Like, this whole country needs to change. You can't treat people like this. Instead, they go, they're lying. They're cowards. They're traitors. There's all these, there's a narrative about refugees and asylum seekers in the countries that they're leaving. And then that same narrative transfers across the countries that they arrive to. So when they come to Australia, they're called queue jumpers. And if it's, if they were real heroes, they would have stayed and fought, and all of these things by people who have no idea what it's like to go to a marketplace and have a bomb go off and kill your family, your kids, everyone. And then the next day, the Taliban does another bombing at the funeral. And then 2 days later, the one guy surviving is told, if you don't leave the country now, we're going to kill you and your mom. Like, they have no concept of that. So no one gets these things. So on one side, they're damned because they remind the country they left how bad it is. On the other side, they're damned because the country that they come to doesn't believe how bad it is. And it's a really difficult thing, like, for them to, but man, every Hazara I've met over here works so incredibly hard. They join Amnesty International, they join human rights groups, they work with other refugees who come from other countries. They are remarkable as a people. The resilience they have, the care, the consideration, the empathy that they show again and again and again. And you think, man, just as resources alone, forget oil, forget coal, forget all that stuff. Pakistan just lost the next generation of doctors, lawyers, physicians, pianists, artists, comedians, whatever, because it just didn't care.
Maybe the right to fear that immigrants will take their jobs because they will work harder than you. And they don't want to work this hard.
Man, it's the odds are stacked. I mean, I work my butt off, but there's a lot of stuff I'm never going to get because I'm not white enough. And I've been, that's been made very clear to me very many times. But that's what I chose. I could have stayed in a country where I'm brown with everyone else who's brown, and I could have, gotten whatever successes come my way that way. But I chose for many reasons to migrate to another country. So that's, the lot in life.
I know when people say that, I get that point, but it's also that it's not like we have we have a lot of privilege. I have a roof over my head. I have food to eat. But there's also that if you're a Shia living in Karachi, even if you haven't experienced a bomb blast, even if you haven't been shot at, maybe a family member has had a bullet dropped in an envelope at your house.
Yeah, that happened to me, but not because I was Shia. That happened because I was writing columns. And I remember, maybe I think a month or two before my visa for Australia arrived, that there was a bullet in my mailbox because I wrote a column criticizing one of the political parties. I can't even remember who it was anymore.
If
The
you're in
next,
Karachi, probably MQM.
no, they were back. I don't know what NQM's like now, but back then they didn't do a bullet in the mailbox. It was a bullet in your head. Like that's
हाँ,
they didn't waste
हाँ.
time with the
अब
mailbox.
तो बेचारे mailbox में भी नहीं डाल सकते.
So, but I remember I remember talking to Sabine Mahmood, and saying, "Hey, this has come," and she was like, she gets them as well, and she's like, "What do we do? Like, what do we do? Stop doing the work we're doing?" And I was like, "I can't do that." She's like, "Well, then just ignore it, I guess." And I was like, "Yeah, you're right." And I told my other friends who were journalists, and they're like, "We all get death threats, get used to it, whatever." And it's a normalization of trauma. And I came to Australia, and it's only later I was like, "That's crazy. Like, you shouldn't have to live with death threats all the time." And then a year and a half later, no, I think it was 3 years later, and I was, in touch with Sabine constantly and everything, and very good friends. And she got shot. She got shot for supporting Valentine's Day or something like that. And I realized, I just realized, I was like, it doesn't matter, man. Like that bullet in the mailbox, like it's a good thing I took it seriously when I did. You can call me a coward or whatever, but I left because I got a kid. I don't want to die.
It's also what we think of trauma as, right? So I made a video. So this is the country that we live in. I made a video mocking Taliban. They came out with 15 demands, out of which I think one was that cricket should be banned because it's a Western sport. This is legit what's happening. So I just made a demand mocking that Misbah-ul Haq should be changed as captain, dressed as a Taliban leader. And then the Taliban got in touch to threaten me. Thankfully, they didn't do anything. Nothing happened. But every single time I was on a traffic signal, my heart jumped a beat. Every time there would be a bike that would come close to my car, I'd start sweating. I'd start having anxiety attacks. And that lasted for 6 to 8 months. And that we're not even going to think of that as trauma or something. They're like,
no.
What are you complaining about? They didn't.
Yeah. But by the way, being threatened by the Taliban is a rite of passage for Pakistani comedians. So I was on Twitter when Twitter was still new and everything, and the Taliban had at the time complained in this sort of, I can't remember, 2010 or so.
Are you even a comedian if you haven't been threatened by the Taliban in Pakistan?
Yeah. Like literally, so they and the same thing. They had complained about TV, about nothing good, like, oh, how dare TV show immoral things and whatever. Pakistanis mullahs love calling everything immoral, except their own existence for some reason. And I put a dumb joke on Twitter, really dumb joke, saying the mullahs Taliban complaining about what's on TV. They don't even sound like they sound like as in like an old man complaining about nothing good to watch anymore or something dumb. It's a bad joke. Ehsanullah Ehsan, the spokesperson for the Taliban, who is currently on the loose, by the way, I think, on Twitter, tweets at me and Zarar Khoro, because Zarar and I were joking about this, and goes, yes, but if you think yes, but our old people have exothermic reactions. And I tweeted back and said, he meant that, our old people explode because they have the suicide bombers. And I wrote back and I said, yeah, but you haven't been around my grandfather after he has a few parathas for breakfast, which is a fart joke. And then he says, why, that's very funny. Why don't you come and do some comedy for us in person? And I'm like, dude, like, what the hell? And I remember
that's probably a parody account, Sami. That's probably not.
No. It was the official Ehsanullah Ehsan proper account.
What, Twitter verified?
But no, it was proper. And you can ask Zarar Khoro about this. Even Zarar was like, dude, what is happening? Why are we trading fart jokes with the Taliban? Like, what is going on? But here's the thing that scared me is I remember a lot of my friends saw that Twitter interaction and they're like, oh my God, that humanized him so much. Like, he was joking. And I was like, I don't want that. I don't want you to humanize Ehsanullah Ehsan. I want you to think of him as a monster, as a demon, as something that must be destroyed. Because to think of him as a human he doesn't get that privilege. And that's the power of comedy for me. is it with comedy you can genuinely humanize things and people that other people don't see as human. And I've used that a lot. And like I do comedy about refugees and asylum seekers, and that's helped so many refugees and asylum seekers here in Australia with funding, with resources and everything, because people who hated refugees and asylum seekers hear the comedy and go, oh, I never thought of it that way. And but I remember learning that lesson from Ehsan Ullah Ehsan. So I guess I learned something from that bastard as well.
Jimmy Fallon got a lot of flack for ruffling Donald Trump's hair, and that was the same argument that he's really humanized Donald Trump to a lot of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Probably a parody account, I'm not sure. And talking about APS, Ehsan Ullah Ehsan was one of the planners of APS.
I know.
And then he became a state guest. The state, and then he magically escaped, and he's still on Twitter. And you're like, wait, what is this country? Why is he a state guest, and how did he escape? And then
which is why, but it's always been like that, right? There's always been that level of madness and craziness and corruption and misery and stuff. And so that's why you do comedy. That's why I did comedy.
So now you're in Australia and you talk a lot about refugee and asylum seekers. Do you get some of that flag that, for instance, as a Pakistani comedian, when white people come to Pakistan and tell us what Pakistan's about, I roll my eyes and I mock that a lot. Do you get that in Australia?
So, I've been here since 2012 now, so it's been 8-9 years. And I've been fairly in the public eye for quite a long time because I work in media and I'm a journalist and all that stuff. And, my comedy's been on TV and stuff. So that's been like, I'm still seen as the immigrant. I'm still seen as a Pakistani comedian. But one of the things I do very aggressively, and I did this very early on, is first is when I criticize something, when I say racism is bad, they'd be like, well, if you don't like it, leave. I'd be like, look, racism is bad. It's not as bad as terrorism, but it's pretty bad. All right. So that's why I'm here. But the other thing is, why do you love racism so much that you'd rather keep the racism and kick out the guy who's like working really hard here? Like, how much do you love racism? Ask yourself that. And then on top of that, like now these days I do a stand-up bit just because, inevitably happens. You make fun of Australia or you say something in Australia and some guy in the audience will be like, if you don't like it, mate, fuck off. And you have to be like, so I was like,
that was a really good Jim Jeffries impersonation.
I can do an Aussie impression. But there's I was like, how do I flip this? How do I flip the narrative so that anyone who thinks that immigrants can't make fun of Australia, I take that away from them. So a bit that I've been doing on stage these days is that if you were born here, you can't criticize it. You have no right to criticize it because you did nothing to earn it. You have nothing. You just turned up and it was great. I moved here. I spent money. I bought a plane ticket. I said bye to my friends. I said bye to my family. I had to come here. I had to learn the language. I had to get a job. I worked hard. I get to criticize it because immigration is a customer service industry. And the customer is always right. And that's the way I kind of flip it around. And it works. Like the audience goes, oh my God, I never thought of it that way. And then they let me say the things I'm going to say. But also part of it is, man, like when I was in Pakistan and I criticized Pakistan and I'm not criticizing because I love criticizing. I'm criticizing because things are bad. And I think things should improve. And I would like to be a part of improving things. So that's all I'm doing. And I'd say those things and people would go, if you don't like it, leave. So I left and I came here. And over here, when things are good, but racism is bad or the treatment of women is bad. If you criticize that and all you're saying is, hey, we can improve, we can make things better. They're like, if you don't like it, leave. And I'm like, go back? They asked me to leave because I was criticizing. And I was like, at some point, the problem isn't with me. It's with the people who can't stand having what's wrong pointed out to them. It's the same people who get angry at refugees for pointing out the flaws in the system. And look, maybe this is just me justifying the fact that I wrote an hour of comedy and I need to perform it no matter what. But that's my philosophy. It's like, things need
all of us that have been asked to leave all these countries should just buy an island somewhere and live with no rules and to be truly free. I think that's the way for
Yeah, but then we'll be shit comedians because we'll all be really happy.
no, we'll make videos and make fun of the countries we left. They'll still get to see
Nah, it's not,
us.
you gotta be in it, man. You gotta really be in
Yeah.
it. You know, it's that kind of a thing.
Did you do any Zoom shows? I detest them from every
Um,
cell in my body.
yeah, I did a few. It was really weird for me. It was really so when I started doing stand up comedy in Pakistan, like one of the things I learned really quickly, you know, when you study stand up is like, oh, you need to perform a lot. Like, you know, comedians abroad, like before, like now I live in Australia, I perform 4 or 5 times a week, every week without fail. You know, it's like, it's just normal. Like, it's just part of my life. I've been doing thousands of shows. But in Pakistan, you do 5 shows a year, 6 shows a year, and you're done. Like, it was like, this is ridiculous. So I discovered, I don't even know if it's around anymore, Second Life. It was like an online virtual world, like World of Warcraft or something. But instead of games, people would just go on there and just like build stuff and have virtual sex or whatever, right? Like that's usually what ends up happening. But I made a comedy club, a virtual comedy club in Second Life, and there's a lot of Americans and Britishers used to log on. So I used to have a headphone set, and I used to talk, do comedy, and my little avatar would have its mouth moving, and people would listen to my comedy and respond by laughing, and then they would pay me money in the in-world currency with which I buy a better comedy club and things. And I started doing that like 3-4 times a week in Pakistan, like just doing comedy to a computer screen, to a computer camera, really, with nothing else going for it. And so when Zoom comedy happened last year during lockdown,
Sami,
I was like, oh, I know how.
this is what happens in countries where there are no school shootings. This is what
Yeah.
sad kids do. They build a second life. Sounds like one of the saddest things I've ever heard.
But man, it made me a better comedian. I got to perform for a while.
It really like set you up for the Zoom world. You were probably the most skilled person to deal with that.
So, and literally that's what happened. So like there was the first, the government over here, the state government in Melbourne where I am, they decided, oh, artists, comedians need money. So they set up a thing where every week there'd be a live show where a bunch of different performers from their homes would do comedy or make music. And that would be live streamed to thousands of people across Melbourne. And it was a paid gig, like it paid really well. And they had me on the first one. And because I've done this years ago, I did it so well. They were like, holy shit, like this guy's really good at doing comedy on the computer. And so they booked me in for every week. And so I did it for like probably 7 months or something of lockdown, nonstop every week. I had a weekly show. It paid me decent money. It paid my rent, you know, it covered my bills. And I had regular comedy gigs, which most comedians, even in Australia, could not say. So yeah, Second Life paid off. You know, never say no to a gig. You never know where
kids who are doing really sad things when you are young. One day this will come into handy and will help you somehow. Let's take it back, ages back. I know this is the first time we're having a conversation, but our paths have crossed way before. Back in 2007, I was doing my A levels and we went to Lums for a competition, and you were a performer. But their sound system crashed, or either you were late and they're like, can somebody from the audience just come up and entertain us for 10 minutes till Sami gets here and we fix the mic? And my friends pushed me on stage. And that was the first time I tried stand-up. It was just things I tell my friends till I cracked some Musharaf jokes and they were like, whoa, come back. And then you went on stage and I forgot the bit, but there was this graphic bit about a woman giving birth and everybody was getting really uncomfortable. I think it was something about abortion or birth. And
I can't remember.
And I was sitting there wondering, how is he comfortable in this pocket where all of us are uncomfortable listening to it, but he's powering through? When did you learn to be fine or be comfortable in that pocket where you're like, this is what I want to say, and if it makes comfortable and I'm not getting a laugh, that's fine. I'm not going to chase that laugh.
But part of it is, okay, firstly, I used to love those Lums gigs, man, because apparently, like, for a while, I remember a few years, bootleg video recordings of my comedy shows used to be passed around on the Lums servers to students and stuff. So that was like a really cool thing.
This is Viley's 2007, in case somebody who's listening was there.
Yeah. Um, Basically, it was very early on. Very early on. I think it might actually have been that show right after the Karsaz bombing, where I muted the mic. Hopefully that
All
helps.
good, all good.
Um,
You have corona. This is how you find out. I mean,
no, yeah, no.
can you smell
Um,
Ehsanullah's farts right now? Can you smell them? If you can't,
he's behind me.
Yeah.
Um, no, the very early on, I realized if I chase the laugh doesn't come. And that's actually a lesson we learned from Blackfish. In Blackfish, it used to be getting one of the things that Saad Harun told me, I remember, it's a very important lesson, that getting the laugh is easy. Getting the laugh is cheap. Anyone can get the laugh. That's not the problem. How do you tell a story well to earn the laugh? You have to earn it. And that was like a really important lesson, to not worry, don't stress, don't take your time. And when I started listening to stand-up comedy, really seriously to study it so I could learn to be a comedian, I started paying attention to structure a lot. I love structure. I'm a structure guy, right? So like whenever I take on a new project, writing work or anything, I study the structure of how other people have done it before I then start doing it myself. And I remember the setup could be 1 minute and then the punchline, or it could be 15 minutes and then the punchline. And the longer the setup, the better the punchline has to be, but also the harder the punchline lands. So the first thing for me was, okay, how can I do stand-up and let the audience trust me enough that if they're not laughing now, they'll keep listening because the laugh might come later. And I don't remember any of the Lumps shows going terribly, which means even at that show, I must have...
Just that 5 minutes in the middle where...
Right. And that 5 minutes in the middle would have been the bit didn't work. But I'm not going to bail on it halfway through. I'm going to say the whole thing. And because I have taken the time to say it and it didn't work, the audience now trusts that at least I'm willing to go where I want to go. The worst thing you can do as a stand-up, in my experience, is let the audience tell you where to go. Like, oh, we're not enjoying this. Oh, change the subject or whatever. Then they're in charge. Then you're not the comedian. They're the comedians. You're the performer. You're the audience. It is about having a certain level of authority. And so for me, it was always that. So even now, like I'll do material where, there'll be big chunks in the middle where there's no laughter. I did a show 2 years ago, which was about free speech and the history of free speech and the way free speech manifests itself and stuff. And it was a lecture/comedy show. And there's big chunks in the middle where I'm just talking about Greek philosophy and the history of Islamic contribution to free speech during the Safavid dynasty and all these things. Audience isn't laughing, but they're willing to trust that I will inevitably give them a laugh at some point. And that's how it works.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who think they're great at improvising generally tend to be not that good, because the first rule of, not the first, but one of the rules of improvising is don't go for the joke. And it's easy to go for the cheap laugh. Like if I walk into an improv scene and I'm like, Sami, we've been married for 10 years, and you turn around and be like, but main to tumhara baap hoon. You'll get a laugh, but you'll destroy everything that we've built. And you're getting the laugh at the expense of your scene partners. It's a lot of these people that you have to unlearn a lot when they come and they start doing improv. Talking about this, being comfortable with that, I'm sure. And didn't you also do like a George Carlin thing for your shows where you would walk up and be like, cock, asshole, now that we're over that, let's get on with the show, or something similar?
No, I remember there was one show where they told me, it was sponsored, I think by Nokia or someone, and they were like, no bad words. So I got up on stage and I did the same, because my thing was always, Saad was the family-friendly comedian. Saad was a clean comedian. And he's very good at that. I haven't seen him in years. He used to be very good at that.
He's still very good at
that.
And
I love Brian Regan. I love Jerry Seinfeld. I love all that stuff. But also, part of the stuff that I grew up watching in comedy, even in Pakistan, was dirty, was filthy, was curse words, because that's the way I talk. I swear a lot. My father's a merchant navy sailor, PNSC, like that's how I grew up. One of my first words was henchod, unfortunately. So it's just how I am. And so I'm not going to on stage not be myself. the closer I can be to who I am off stage to on stage is the happier I am and the better I am as a comedian. So I made that realization very early in my career. So when they told me no cursing, I went on stage and I was like, okay, they told me no cursing. I'm going to substitute the curse words. So instead of like, fuck, I will say, floof. And then I said one of the jokes and used floof in the same places where fuck would have gone. And the audience was like, what the hell is this? Like they reacted like, this is ridiculous. Like they couldn't laugh at the joke. It was distracting. And I was like, there you go. Sometimes a curse word is the right word. And I need to use the right word. Should I use the right word? And the audience is like, yay! And so it was just basically me being a dick, like not following the sponsor's edict. They had the money, they were giving me money. But that's why that's why I'm not world famous still, because I just destroy my career again and again.
So you're much further along in your stand-up comedy career than me, but it's also stand-up comedy as a form is also evolving right now. You mentioned Brian Ring and Jerry Seinfeld. There's a thing that everybody should watch if you're interested in stand-up comedy. There's Louis C.K., Ricky Gervais, Chris Rock, and Jerry Seinfeld in an HBO special called Talking Funny, where Jerry Seinfeld's like, you need to laugh every 12 seconds. And they're like, wait, what? No, you don't. And even this idea that we grew up with, because I'm also a nerd about stand-up comedy, I'd also nerd out. I'd also think about the structure. I'd literally put down tables, set up punchline. But now where the form's going, especially with something like Nanette by Hannah Gadsby, which has pissed off a lot of old comedians who are like, this isn't even comedy. The old idea that if you have a 15-minute setup, then the punchline needs to be worth those 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Is maybe gone out of the window, even if you're uncomfortable, even if you're talking.
Well, Nanette Hannah threw that out. Like I know Hannah because she's a Melbourne. Yeah, she used to be a Melbourne comic. Now she's an LA comic. We gigged together many times, and Hannah threw out that whole rule, which was a punchline has to follow a setup, right? And a lot of I know comedians who are like, well, that's not stand-up comedy, and I'm like, well, there's no one thing that's stand-up comedy. Right? Like in music, there's no one thing. There's music, there's qawwali, there's jazz, there's rock and roll, there's, whatever. Same with stand-up comedy. There's many types of stand-up. There's Jerry Seinfeld and there's Hannah Gadsby. There's, there's Brian Regan and there's Bill Burr. There's, whoever you want. So that's a part of the art form that I really like, is the fact that, it's constantly changing, that you're pushing it. It's, some of my favorite comedians. I remember when I moved to Melbourne. So Melbourne has the Melbourne International Comedy Festival, the second largest comedy festival in the world. It's lots of fun. And you see a lot of amazing comedians. There's a comedian who used to live here, now lives in New Zealand, named Laura Davis. And she's a really good friend of mine. I'd never seen her do a full show. So I went to a show. I went to her show 2 days before my show was about to start. My first ever Melbourne Comedy Festival show.
I can already tell it's a bad idea.
Right. And it's going to be this is going to be my best hour of material. All the material I've done over years, taking all the best bits, putting them together into 1 hour. I go to Laura's show. Laura's show is about the time she tried to commit suicide and how that didn't even work, and how she processes that now and how she comes to the terms of the fact that she didn't commit suicide. And it was funny. It was dark. People were crying, sad tears of grief, and then laughing so hard that one woman had to walk out because she was going to vomit. It was unbelievable. I was like, I didn't know you could do this. What the hell am I doing? My show is shit. And I threw out literally a whole hour's long show. And I sat down outside like a 7-Eleven at 2 a.m. and wrote a whole new show on paper. And it was a show about migrating, about leaving Pakistan. And that was the first time, and that was 4 years after I moved to Australia. That was the first time I very honestly sat and went, what does it mean? What is this thing that I have put myself through? I'm not going to see my parents all the time. I haven't seen them now in 2-3 years, because of lockdown and stuff and coronavirus. And that's a massive loss from having them in my life every day. I'm not going to be able to go to freaking Tariq Road or Bots or all these places forever, maybe, I've given all that up. What is that? Why did I do that? Like, what does it mean? What are these things I've gone through? What happened with that terror attack at Karsaz and when I saw a man's lungs on fire? And I wrote a show about those things. And that's one of the first shows I've ever written that won me an award. Like, and it was, but I didn't write it so I could win an award. I just wrote it because I was like, I want to write something honest. I want to write something that's true. And now every year I try to think like, okay, how can I be true to what I want to tell? So this year's show is totally different, tonally, structurally, from last year's show and from the year before that and everything. And that might be a bad idea professionally because that means that people don't know what to expect from me, but I like doing the things I like doing because they challenge me. And that's what I've been doing basically.
So one thing's the form, like Hannah Gatsby, Bo Burnham does a phenomenal job. Maria Bamford, I'm not a fan of personally, but I mean, she has an
I think
audience.
she's amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
She has an audience, but you still have Jerry Seinfeld. You still have, I mean, Hassan Minhaj, I think does a good job at Homecoming King. Neil Brennan, I love. If people haven't seen Three Mice,
Yeah,
Neil Brennan
it's
is a
great.
genius. How much of it is just the form and how much of it is you also evolving, right? Because when I started off, I was also chasing the funny. And a lot of times we grew up in a culture which is racist, which is sexist. So I did Pathan jokes on my first special because those are jokes I grew up with. And then the first thing was shedding that off, that I just don't want a cheap laugh. If these are jokes that you might get on an SMS, those are jokes I don't want to do. And then slowly over the years, I'm like, I just want to speak my truth. And if you find the humor in it, great. But what's more important to me is speaking my truth and being honest about it. And there are comedians who can choose not to do that. You wouldn't know who Jerry Seinfeld is, what his parents went through if you listen to his special. He's just his observational comedy, goes home, goes to sleep, and can do that. But there are a lot of comedians who put their person in it. You see the hurt, you see who that human being is. I'm assuming that also comes with time, where when I started off, people were like, it'll take a decade for you to find your voice. I'm like, bakwas kar rahe hain, ye kya hota hai, finding your voice. And some comedian, maybe it was Gilbert Gottfried, who said, if you're younger than 30, you're not even a comedian. You're not even a stand-up.
Yeah.
So,
They were wrong. I remember
your journey that brought you here.
I mean, yeah, I've been doing it 15 years now, and I'm 42 years old. And I can honestly say that the last year is where I've finally gotten comfortable in my voice. Where I now, like, I've been a good comedian. It's not like I'm a bad comedian in the past or anything. I'm a reliable comedian. I get work regularly as a comedian professionally because I know how to do this well. But what do I want to say and how do I want to say it is something I've always struggled with. I've struggled with the thing of like, I want to talk about observational stuff. Forget race, forget politics. Stop being a political comedian. Just be a Seinfeldian comedian. And then I tried that and I was like, no, but it needs to matter. The things I want to say need to matter. Okay, I'll talk about race and politics. And I talk about those things. And I'd be like, what about my life? What about me? What about my experiences? My story? Okay, I'll do one about, and it was always, so like literally last year, or we didn't have a comedy festival last year. Year before last, the show was about, it was a monologue on the history of free speech. The year before that, the show was just stand-up, pure stand-up. The year before that was the show that won a lot of awards and everything, was my journey through and out of religion and the history of Islam and all of these things. And that was another show. And the year before that was like the suicide show or the whatever. Like it just, and at some point I was, I had this thing. I was like, why is my voice changing all the time? What am I doing on stage every year? Why am I doing a different show? And I enjoy that as well. I enjoy that challenge. But part of it, I just wasn't feeling comfortable. It was like someone changing their clothes all the time, trying to find the right fit. And I genuinely think it takes 10, 12 years before you start figuring out the right fit, and another 3-4 years before that fit actually works on you and you conform to it. So that's what I'm doing now, is I've really genuinely found, that's what my voice is. Let's see how I write for that voice. And I'm enjoying that process a lot,
What was the suicide show?
The suicide joke is basically, I'm trying to remember the exact phrasing of it. Yeah, it was like, yeah, I was talking to my therapist, and my therapist was like, do you have suicidal thoughts? And I'm like, yeah, but not more than anyone else, like just a normal amount. Like, who doesn't have suicidal thoughts? Everyone does. And then I do like a whole long riff on like, how do you commit suicide? Because for me, it's a thing of like, okay, if I live alone, I have my daughter a week on, week off, because I'm divorced, and we share custody, my ex-wife and I. So, and I was like, well, if I kill myself on the weekend, I don't have my daughter, then the cats will eat my face, and my daughter's going to find me, and I'll be half eaten by the cats, and that's gross. She doesn't need to see that. But I don't want to kill myself when she's here, because then she has to do the cleanup, and that's a nightmare. It was that kind of a thing. And it came from a real thing where, like, I was a point in my life where I was genuinely suicidal. I had people checking in on me because I was scared about, I was in a bad place in my life. And I just thought, I want to talk about that, honestly. And that was like a really fun experience for me to talk about that. I mean, being alive to talk about it. Yeah.
As somebody who's also gone through suicide ideation, and I've talked about it a lot as well, do you feel like comedy or depression same ही चीज है? It's like two sides of the same coin.
Man, this is because there's the whole cliche about comedians, right? Like where they're laughing.
The Watchmen joke.
This Watchmen joke, Pagliacci, and the sad clown, and that. And I always like saying, nah. But part of it is, I don't think I used to be this depressed as a person when I was younger. I think I was a really well put together person. One of it is life just happens. Life just keeps hitting you and hitting you and hitting you. And you reach your 40s and you're like, I am tired. But I think the other thing is, what we do is we genuinely rappel down the pit of self. We genuinely go into our own bodies and our histories and our lives and our stories and mine them and belittle them for comedy. And that takes a toll. And I think like, you don't have to be depressed to be a comedian. I'm sure there's a large amount of comedians who are depressed. Compared to dentists, more dentists commit suicide than any other profession, right? Like, so like, who the hell knows why that's happening? But I do think that comedians are raw nerves exposed to the world. Like, there's no skin over us. There's that epidermal layer is gone. It's just the nerves underneath, and they're exposed, And so even a light breeze hurts us. Now, the benefit of that is we can then think about the light breeze and everything that happens. If two people interact in front of you, as a comedian, you're thinking, okay, how did that interaction funny? What can I do with this interaction? How can I process it? Etc. etc. Other people just go, oh yeah, whatever, and they move on. And I think that's what makes us the way we are. I don't know whether it's the flip side of the same coin. I know a lot of dead comedians, probably more, but I also know a lot of dead journalists, but the journalists were killed and the comedians killed themselves. And I think maybe that's the difference.
So even when I look back at my childhood, I think I was great. I didn't have the stress. I didn't have the depression. I didn't have anxiety. But when I reflect upon it or talk to my therapist, I sometimes felt like I needed to be funny to deserve my seat at the table. And maybe sometimes I felt like my friends only like me because I'm cracking jokes. They don't actually like me.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of insecurity there. And that's just part and parcel of it. There's a really good, you've read Neil Gaiman?
I've read some of Neil Gaiman, of course.
Yeah, okay. So Neil Gaiman, when he wrote Sandman, the comic books in the 1980s and 90s, he wrote in one of the issues of the comic books, he had William Shakespeare, and he was describing Shakespeare's life. And there's a scene where Shakespeare is talking to one of the characters, Dream, who Neil Gaiman had created. And Shakespeare tells the character Dream that when my son died, I grieved, but a part of my brain was thinking, oh, this is what grief is like. Remember this. You can use it in a story. When I felt love, a part of my brain was detached thinking, oh, this is what love is like, I've had, bad stuff happen in my life. I was in a car accident once where I should have died. I've been threatened by ISIS at one point, like weird stuff. And while it was happening, a part of my brain was going, how can I make this funny on stage? how can I write about this? How can I use it in a story? Something. I want to use it. I want to make sure this, don't forget the details because they might come in handy in something later. And that creates a level of distance between you and the people near you, close to you, around you. They can't tell sometimes, and sometimes they can. The more astute ones can. But it sucks because it's how our brain works. It's what makes us do what we do well. But also there's a price, and everything comes with a price. And the price of that is you're never fully in the moment. And that's why when you hang out with your friends, you're going, are they laughing at me because they're my friends, or are they laughing at me because, I'm funny? Like, it's those kind of things. You're never just going, they're laughing, I'm laughing, we're having fun.
It's also made worse when you're a little well known, because, for instance, now in public places, and yeah, I can go to the street, nobody knows me because comedy in Pakistan is so niche. But in certain crowds or certain places where you expect people to know you, they see you in a certain way. Like, for instance, I was tripping on MDMA at a party, and I'm in the middle of my trip. And this happened very recently where I was like, I need to just stop. I can't do this anymore. Where somebody stops me and is like, do you have any alcohol on you? And I'm like, no. And he's like, you're a comedian. You must be kidding with me, bro. Come on. Just give me some alcohol. And I'm just like, you stopped my trip to say this to me.
Yeah.
And it just, sometimes you get annoyed and leave, but sometimes there's an instinct in you which are like, oh, they expect me to be funny right now. Let me turn on and be that person for them.
Part of it for me was making it very, like, some people know me as a comedian, some people know me as a writer, some people know me as a journalist. I've been lucky that way. I've done, my hero growing up was Stephen Fry. And Stephen Fry.
You've done a show, you worked with Stephen Fry, which is insane.
I did QI with Stephen Fry, and that was an amazing thing. And I've spoken to him many times since then as well. And one of the things that I asked him, I was like, weren't you ever worried that you'd be a jack of all trades, master of none? And he said, no, I just was worried about getting bored. And I was like, that's the thing that's fueled me always, is I get bored if I do the same thing again and again. So for me, it's a thing where I've been really lucky that I've always gone, I don't care whether I'll be successful at this. I want to do it. And so I've done other things as well. And people know me from those different things, So my comedy audience doesn't really overlap with my writing audience. My writing audience doesn't really overlap with my journalism or broadcast or podcasting or whatever audiences, which sucks because I could sell more tickets if they all overlap, or sell more books. But anyway, that's a whole different problem. But as a result, I've made it very clear to anyone I ever meet that I'll never perform for them unless I am ready to perform, which is when I'm on stage or when I'm writing or when I'm giving a lecture or talk or something. That's when I'm performing. If you meet me on the streets or anything like that, and you're like, hey, be funny or whatever, it's like, no. I'll be funny when I want to be funny. If I'm funny right now, it's because I thought of something funny to say, because I'm a funny person and I like being funny, but I'm not performing. And it's a very clear distinction. And the trick is to learn to do that without, I guess, being rude. Some people are rude when they do that. I've met actors and stuff who are real dicks about it. And I don't like being a dick. I don't like treating people badly. So I like being polite. But, there'll be situations where people will really push you to perform. And then you very politely make it clear that you're not going to, and you interact.
But I also get it. I think it was one of the actors in Dear Evan Hansen. Maybe it wasn't Ben Platt, maybe it was somebody else. And people online were like, he's the rudest Broadway actor, because people usually after shows, people line up outside that an hour or two later after the show, when they come out, they take pictures. And he popularly doesn't do that. And people were like, that's the rudest thing, because we waited outside. And he's like, I have given my soul on stage. I have nothing left. Either I can do that for 2 hours on stage and recharge my batteries, or I can come out and get pictures. So some of it is performing, but some of it is even normal interactions, like responding to a friend. Once you're done with a show, you feel like you don't even have the energy to do that, to say hi to someone.
Yeah.
You've given up so much.
Part of it is also, I think, you're in that unlucky situation that I was in, which is performing is so rare. You don't build up the antibodies to it. You don't build up the resistance needed to, like, to make it normal. now, like, one of the great joys, honestly to God, and I hope you get to experience this, I really do, because it's the best, is when you're at a comedy club with 10 other comedians, and then after the club show finishes, everyone does 7 to 10 minutes. You do well, you do badly, it doesn't matter. You all go out for food afterwards, and then because there's adrenaline, and you want to burn off the adrenaline, and you all talk. And comedians are the only people who can talk to other comedians. No one else can talk to us properly, because comedians don't mess about. We don't waste time. We don't do small talk. There are comedians that I will meet once every 3 years, and within 30 seconds of meeting them again, we'll be talking about most personal things, because that's how we talk. That's how comedians connect with each other, right? And we laugh, and we say the darkest, worst things, and make each other laugh, and all of that stuff. And it's great. But what happens when you do that again and again and again is you normalize performance. And you normalize the post-performance period and the pre-performance period. One of the things that I remember was a big surprise to me, that I had other comedians, more senior comedians, tell me is normal, was that low feeling after a good show. You have a great show and you feel terrible after it. And I remember going like, I know why some comedians committed suicide. And I bet it was because they had a great show just before. Because you're such a high.
Yes.
What can compare to 50 people, 100 people, sometimes 2,000 people, whatever, 20,000 people, all laughing at it, something you just said to make them laugh, and the applause, the validation, and it's amazing. And then you drive home, you stop at a gas station, and you fill petrol, and you eat a sandwich, and you go home. That come down is too severe. And learning to deal with that come down, be okay with that come down, and that's another big thing. And that's why, like, comedians learn those tricks of, like, just how to handle a good show and how to handle a bad show and stuff like that. Whenever I have a bad show, whenever I have a good show, I meet up with other comedians afterwards. Yep. It's just an amazing privilege to have that. And I'm very lucky that I have that now. I know for it, like 7-8 years, I didn't.
You're right. I was in New York for a couple of years doing shows there. So I did my master's there.
Yeah.
The shows also didn't matter that much. Like, I could literally experiment, be a different person on stage. Nobody knows me. It doesn't matter. Nothing's at stake. I do 7 minutes. We hang out backstage. We do shorts. It's a great time. It's in Pakistan when maybe the highs are much greater. Like, if you're doing a sold out show, and maybe it's just the fact that मैं Pakistani हूँ, but वो Pakistani laughter जो होता है ना, it hits you differently. It hits you differently.
Yeah. It comes from the soul, and it hits you in the soul.
So then you experience that, and then you go home, and you come home to nothing, and you're alone in your bed, and you're like, I had hundreds of people eating at the palm of my hands like 2 hours ago.
Yeah.
Now I'm here. So because the highs are much greater, the lows are much greater.
The highs are much greater. Yeah, you just have to learn to manage that. That's all it is. And the worst thing young comedians do, is then manage that with, like, alcohol or drugs or whatever. The way to manage that is socialization. You have a great
with
show.
Drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, I guess. But, the best way to go is, honestly, just grab your friends afterwards, go out for a pizza or whatever, and sit down and just talk shit, and let yourself come down slowly, gradually, gently, and you'll feel a lot better afterwards. Because that sudden drop down, that's what kills people, I think. And hey, by the way, in the meantime, we've gotten a question on Twitter. I don't know how many questions you would have gotten. I can't imagine many.
But I'm hogging all the questions that I want to ask. But what's the question?
Okay. This is the one that I've been worried about, though. It's hi Shehzad. It's on Twitter. It's a response to you. Hi Shehzad, he's very open about his atheism. Can you please ask him, why do most ex-Muslims become a part of the Western right wing? And how does he manage to keep distance from them? I mean, how is critical of Islam and still called, he is critical of Islam and still called there Islamophobia in the West, unlike others. Thanks.
Go for it. Somebody also asked, how do you get used to the taste of bacon? Which I thought was a better question.
The way you get used to the taste of bacon is the same way you get used to, I guess, anything in life, man. It's basically once, for me, talking about the religion thing is a very scary thing, because yes, I'm an atheist. Yes, I am But when I did a show about it, which became a book and everything, it was a very nuanced explanation where it was like, I still consider myself a cultural Muslim because I grew up a Muslim. I still say Toba, Mashallah, Astaghfirullah, whatever. And I say all those things. The moment anything bad happens, I go, Nazar lag gayi, nazar lag gayi. You know, like that's my...
Especially during turbulence. You kick into Aitul Kursi so fast, you're like, the other people are now staring at
So that's the whole part of it. Because it's part of culture. Religion for me is culture. The only difference between me and a person who believes in religion is, for me, all religion, not just Islam, all religion is man-made. I just don't believe in a divine creature like a god or anything. For me, that doesn't make it less amazing. It's incredible that humans made these amazing stories. It's the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is the Zoroastrian stories of Ahura Mazda and everything. It's the ancient Babylonian stories that became Judaism, which became in the end combined with Mithraism from the east and became Christianity during the first century in the Roman Empire. And inevitably, it is also whatever those religions blended with whatever Arab cultural stories were happening at the time. And those became Islam, and how that then spreads through the world. All of that's amazing to me. I love history. I love human history. I was very close to doing my PhD in history, and then I decided I don't have the time for that. But that stuff's amazing to me. But the problem is when you think that way, when you think the way I do, seeing it as divine or seeing the presence of something divine just doesn't make sense. But I have no disagreement with the people who are religious, as long as it is in moderation, like with anything else, right? So you interviewed Dr. Temur, what's his full name? Temur Rahman. He's a communist, right? So was Stalin, and so was Chairman Mao. Now, Temur Rahman is not advocating that we kill millions and millions of people to feed parts of Pakistan. Or
I'm not going to put words in his mouth. I'm not sure.
I mean,
He's been tagging me.
Look, I haven't heard his full
He's been
policy.
tagging me relentlessly. All the Uyghur Muslim stuff in China is propaganda, and I'm like, why don't you come out and say it? Why be coy about it? If you're fine with what's happening in Uyghur concentration camps, just come out and say it, right?
Really? That's disappointing coming from him. But
his position is a lot of it is Western propaganda, and I'm like, so are you saying it's not happening? And he stops short of saying that. So I'm not sure.
I don't know, man. I work with a lot of Chinese journalists who are now in Australia, and they have evidence that it has been happening, but it's worse than we think it is.
You can be a communist and you can support a system without having to support every single thing they do.
Exactly. So here's the thing. So there's the extremists in that system, and then there's the extremists in Islam. And then my parents are Muslim. Like whenever I tell my parents I'm an atheist, they're like, "Acha bakwas mat karo." Change the subject. Like that's how it is.
Kuch nahi hota. Atheist kuch nahi hota.
Acha वैसे ही namaz पढ़ी या नहीं? It's like I just said, So that's how it is in terms of my understanding and appreciation of it all. I don't want people who identify as Muslims to be vilified and to be attacked in public, to be abused and to be made feel unsafe. I don't want that. I look Muslim. I am still, like I said, I am a Muslim still in everything except for practice of ritual. That's just part of it. But the other part of it is also that I have a level of cynicism around Islam. It's not because I don't know about the subject. I know a lot about it. And I know enough to know that I don't believe certain things that many moderate Muslims and stuff can look away from. Christianity also says, all kinds of ridiculous things. Kill women for wearing raw silk, and that's in one of the hadiths as well, and all kinds of things. Christians obviously don't practice that. They practice other things. The way they do it, the way moderate Muslims do it, the way many Muslims live their lives as Muslims, is they pay attention to the parts that make sense to them and ignore the parts that don't. And for me, that's fine. That's your choice. The problem starts when you then start saying, as cousins and aunts and uncles of mine have said to me, that I deserve to die, I am dead to them, I should be killed for existing, when for 2 years, I couldn't perform a single comedy show because I was getting threats from Muslims across the world. I couldn't go on Instagram without death threats and abuse and photoshopped images of my heads on stakes and sticks and things. And, all people threatening my daughter, people threatening my ex-wife, all of these things happening because people don't like the idea that you can leave a religion. If your system requires adherence unto death, you need to ask, why does the system depend on that to exist? Because a system that cannot hold up to questioning is a system that is man-made and thus fallible, just like any other system. There is no such thing as a perfect system. I am fine with that conversation. I can have that conversation. But whenever I try having that conversation, it results in death threats and abuse and, all of those things. And I can't go back to Pakistan because this one guy recognizes me from a Daily Mail article, 5 years ago, which took my long, nuanced explanation published in a book, which wasn't even about that. The book was about the Muslims of Australia and the different communities and the beautiful richness of their culture. One chapter was about ex-Muslims. The Daily Mail took all of that and said Sami Shah left Pakistan because he hates Islam. And it turns out Muslims believe in 3 things in Pakistan. They believe in the Quran, the Hadith, and the Daily Mail. And the end result, as you're seeing with the attack going on Misha Shafi right now, is that's totally true. And so, yeah, that's where I sit on that stuff, where I'm not anti-Islam, I'm not anti-Muslim. And that's why I don't tolerate prejudice against anyone. And so I will not sit by and let people treat Muslims with prejudice either. But I will also not sit by and let Muslims treat others with prejudice, the way they treat minorities in their countries, women in their countries, all of those things. And for some people, when I wrote a book about it, and the book was called The Islamic Republic of Australia, because it was largely about Muslims in Australia, and I thought that was a funny title. When the book came out, Daily Mail published a headline. ISIS and Taliban and everything saw that. And I had Muslims around the world, hundreds and thousands of them, sending me death threats and abuse and murder, and I hope you die. And the Pakistani community in Australia only now has decided to reach out to me to be, hey, want to hang out? And I'm like, fuck you guys, man. I've been here for 8 years, busting my ass. I'm like a representative of the brown community in Australia, one of the only people. And you go angry because I'm not Muslim enough for you. And at the same time, the far right in Australia got angry with me because they were like, this guy's a Muslim. He's from Pakistan. He must be Muslim. He must be brown. And we hate him. And he's trying to take jobs away from white people because he's on radio and TV. And so this side, and I was in this wonderful position where I had 2 groups of people attacking me for different reasons, but the same issue. And so I was like, oh, there's an overlap.
If you're hated by everybody, you're doing something right. And I think it's also that people have difficulty having nuanced conversations. You can criticize all the things wrong about Muslim countries and also criticize Islamophobia and also criticize certain treatments, right? Was South Asia more progressive pre-colonization? Absolutely. We criticize blasphemy laws for being regressive. Well, blasphemy laws are colonial.
If you go through Muslim history, there were many, some of the great Muslim scholars we talk about, Ibn Battuta and all of these people, Abu Sina, there were atheist scholars amongst them, and some of them were put to death, but others weren't. Others were very open in their writings about their scientific beliefs and thus lack of religious beliefs, and they were tolerated and they were accepted at the time because people didn't care about their religious beliefs. They only cared about their own religious beliefs.
So right now there's this Islamic preacher, engineer Muhammad Ali Mirza. He had an assassination attempt because he said कि फिक़्ह हनफिया में ब्लास्फेमी की डेथ है ही नहीं सजा. आप सारी स्कॉलरशिप देख लें, वो है ही नहीं.
Yeah.
Now, the fact that in Pakistan, the people who get up and shoot people over just alleged blasphemy, is that a fiqh, Hanifiya problem? Is that a capitalist problem? Is that the reason that there's certain Maulvis who make a lot of money by preaching certain things? Is that problem? Is that economic? You really need to assess that. And a lot of times what happens is, where the question is maybe coming from, is when you immediately leave and you don't have distance, you hate everything about it. And I don't blame people. If you're especially a gender sexual minority who has been demonized for years, it makes sense for you to take that hate that you have for a certain Maulvi and say, I hate all Islam. It makes sense to me. But as you start reclaiming your identity, maybe over years, and I think you're in an advantageous position over a lot of people because you've gone through a journey and you're at 42 right now.
Well, but I don't, the part I reject. Sorry, continue.
Maybe some of the voices online are these 18, 20-year-olds who are still figuring out exactly what they believe in. And some of that manifests into hate.
I think the part I reject in the question that was tweeted is where they say most ex-Muslims are aligned with the right, the far right and stuff in Western countries. I reject that. I know many ex-Muslims, and most of them sit in the same place I do, because most of their parents and loved ones and friends and partners and everyone are Muslims, and they know the difference between a moderate Muslim and an extremist Muslim and a fundamentalist and a liberal and all of those things. It's what ends up happening with the ex-Muslim community, all right, is the same thing that Muslims hate when it happens to them. If I was to say all Muslims are terrorists because there was a Muslim, because of Osama bin Laden, one Muslim terrorist or many Muslim terrorists, whatever, that's unfair to all Muslims. The same way, you can't say all ex-Muslims are obsessed with Islam, are far right, or any of those things, because you've seen one or two get accepted by the far right, who probably would be far right no matter what, right? You're doing the same thing there, that you don't like being done to you. And the inability to see that hypocrisy is always very frustrating. I also, like, when that stuff happened, in all those death threats and abuse that I was getting, I also got hundreds upon hundreds of messages from people in Pakistan, in India, in Saudi Arabia, in Lebanon, in Jordan, all over, and in Muslim communities in America and England and Australia, going, I don't believe. I'm an atheist. Like, it's just not for me. I've understood the religion and I don't believe in it, but my parents will beat me to death if I tell them. Or many people, I am gay. I am a woman who wears a hijab and doesn't want to wear it anymore. I'm a gay Muslim who doesn't believe in religion because it says I'm an abomination, but I can't come out. My parents will kill me. My family will kill me. And this many things. And so it's this thing of like, okay, if moderate Muslims want to worry about the state of Islam, what you should be doing is making Islam easier for people to leave if they want to, because that freedom to leave might make someone appreciate it more. Because guess what? When you trap someone somewhere, they want to break free, as Queen so beautifully put it. But if you open a door and tell someone you can come in and go anytime you want, you'd end up like Christianity and Judaism, which, like it or not, has a shit ton of believers as well. Judaism less so, but Christianity is still the number one religion in the world for a reason in terms of growth, because it's easier to walk in and out.
And it's also a narrative, right? So for instance, there's an international publication, which is very, very respectable. They said, you're doing a show at T2F, can we come and shoot it and do an interview? I was like, absolutely. I think this will be great. They came, they shot the show was great. And I was like, this is going to be a really good report. When it came out, the lens they put on it was, in a country where people are shot for blasphemy, Shazal Ghayas Sheikh does comedy. And I was like, ये दोनों चीजें एक साथ आई कैसे? And it's not like
man, I had so many stories.
But it's not like, I don't think the journalist has a Western agenda. I don't think they want me killed. It's just they think, what is the best way to get most clicks?
Yes.
And they don't care the narratives they're forming while doing that. So maybe the question's coming from a place of voices you hear, whether they're online, whether they're on publications like Daily Mail. The Daily Mail will not have you come on and have a nuanced conversation. They'll want an angry person come on, which furthers their agenda.
And it's just that. It's about looking at that agenda and understanding. There's a really cool, I remember I reached out to a few friends when I was getting those death threats and everything. One of my friends who is very well-versed in religious quotes and everything. And he said to me, he's like, man, anyone accuses you, show them the Daily Mail and show them the quote from the Hadith where the Prophet Muhammad says, the person who believes a liar's lie is worse than the liar. You know, and I'm like, yeah, that's good. I like that one. That's a really, that makes sense. That's a wise quote, because all it's saying is that at least double check, man. If you're going to send someone death threats, if you're going to take the time out to tell them how you're going to track him down and kill him and his daughter, his child, because you don't agree with the fact that he doesn't believe in the thing you believe in, just double check about what was said by him and who says he said it. And if you're still that angry, I don't know, you've made your life choices. I can't control that.
Again, it's we can't have these conversations without nuance, right? So when we talk about the global south, are a lot of Muslim countries aggressive? Yes. Are a lot of Muslim countries poor? Yes. Have a lot of Muslim countries been colonized? Yes. Have a lot of Muslim countries been deliberately made impoverished? Yes. Does that contribute to the anger? Absolutely.
Of course.
How much of this is just purely economic? Whereas it's also what you're projecting, right? When you think of Muslim, you think of Taliban, whereas Baba Bulle Shah was more progressive than the white colonizers. You will find such a gender spectrum in Baba Bulle Shah's poetry, but we're not projecting that.
But that's the beauty of history, right? That's why I love studying history. Like if you go back to the medieval era, the low Middle Ages, particularly in European history, during that time, this is like, even after the Mongols had kind of been through the Baghdad and all these areas and kind of devastated and destroyed the Muslim civilizations, we were still at a level of progress and stuff in our parts of the world where we had tolerance, you know. But in the meantime, the Christian communities in Germany, in England, and all these places did not, because they had poverty, they had misery, they had deprivation. So you had wars between the Protestants and the Catholics, and the Catholics and the Protestants and the Anabaptists, and you know, the Siege of Munster, which is a very famous story about. You listen to the Siege of Munster story, and it genuinely sounds like the Lal Masjid story from Islamabad, but like taking place, 1,000 years ago, and a little bit more sex probably. But like, it's just those kinds of things. And you start realizing that, okay, how much of this is connected to all the things you listed, to poverty, to misery, to colonization, to all of those things. And then how do you get out of it? The problem is, and the thing that I'm always wary about, is using that, not denying the toll that colonization has taken, but also not using it as an excuse for bad behavior again and again and again and again and again, basically.
It's not an excuse. It's just realizing that happened.
Oh, but it's the reality. We are post-colonial societies. Yeah. It's, the trauma of colonization, like you were talking about trauma right at the start, is another thing that we have not dealt with. When you talk about, one of the people I respect the most is, I know a lot of Palestinians, and they blow my mind. The poetry, the art, the culture, the community, and everything that Palestinians have everywhere I meet them, anywhere in the world. But the thing I love about Palestinian culture and community, and I might be generalizing here, is how openly they grieve and process their grief publicly, repeatedly, without shame, that grief is something to be hidden. When they talk about the Nakba, when they talk about everything that's happened since then, they aren't hiding it. They're suffering. And they blame the people who put them through that suffering, but they're processing that suffering as well. And through that processing of it, then I think the way that they've dealt with things is a lot better than the way we would have. We oppress, we suppress, we push everything down, and that leads to ugly situations.
What the tangential baat hai, and maybe you're not even the right person to talk to this about, but you also, you said you've never cried, but you also feel like maybe the Shia community is much better at grieving than the Sunni community.
There is that aspect for sure. I don't know what it's like in Sunni communities, but obviously in Shia we have the julus and the matam and that kind. But also part of it is, especially when you're growing up as a kid, is you all learn through the fake cry and the sound of the fake crying, because you win, like you want to impress your grandparents by how hard you cried versus the other. That's the whole part of the culture of it as well, and then it's like, look at how hard I did matam, look at my chest, like that's all stuff we grew up with. It's it's one of those things where those 10 days are great for crying. But then and you're only allowed to cry during those 10 days about what happened to Imam Hussein and everything, and all of that. You're not crying about what happened when you got rejected by the girl in 7th grade, or what happened when your grandfather was killed, or that journalist you worked with who was a close friend of yours had the head blown off. Like, that's not something you're processing. So that's probably a problem.
I know I've taken up a lot of your time, but there's...
No, I'm enjoying the hell out of this.
Oh.
I don't know how you're going to edit this, by the way.
I don't. I post them as it is. I don't...
This is going to be a 2.5-hour podcast.
I posted podcasts that are 5 hours.
How many listeners do you have? Are both of them listening at the same time? Or how does it work?
We just crossed 1 million views. The podcast has been heard for 211,000 hours.
That's hilarious. That's amazing. Congratulations. But also, wow. Other than Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, I don't listen to any podcast.
I love Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. After talking to you, I'm like, maybe there's also a crossover in between being a history nerd and being a comedian. I think it's a Patton Oswalt bit where, like, the way you find out you've turned 40 is you're suddenly interested in World War II history.
Yeah, basically. Very much so, man. I have literally a joke in my act right now about the Eastern Front and how people don't laugh when you do Eastern Front comedy and how they only laugh at Western Front comedy. And that purely comes from Dan Carlin's Ghosts of the Ostfront show. So, yeah, I'm hardcore.
There's also, I think, an entire Eddie Izzard R on World War II history, which is also one of my favorite comedians. Do you have a flag? Cake or death? Cake or death? So this is one of our avid listeners, Geek Foodie on Instagram. They have a question. How did you transition from being a stand-up comedian to being a fantasy fiction author?
I think transition means I stopped doing one and started doing the other. That never happened really. I always wanted to be... Comedy came later in my life. Like, I love doing comedy and everything, but I didn't even think about doing comedy until I was 21, 22 years old. I've wanted to be a writer and be a fantasy fiction horror writer since I was 9, probably, when I first read Stephen King and Ursula Le Guin. And both those books kind of changed my brain. So I always wanted to write that. And when I moved to Australia, I tried many times to write books in Pakistan. It just never happened. When I moved to Australia, I ended up living in a small country town because I got the visa that required that. And I couldn't work for like 3-4 years properly. I didn't have a full-time job. I was doing comedy, but not much else. So I had a lot of free time. And I was like, what should I do? And I was like, well, just write. You always want to be a writer, and just try it. So I gave myself a challenge where I wrote 3 opening sentences for books, just random, off the top of my head. And I told them, sent them to a friend, and I said, pick one. And the one you pick is the one I'll write a book on. And one of them was, the sentence was, Wahid's father was a textile merchant and his mother was a jinn. And my friend said, that's the one I want to hear more about. And I was like, all right, cool. And so I started writing it. And I wrote it, and it took me about a few months to write it, and it took me a long time to make it good. And that was a much longer time. And that became my first kind of fantasy fiction novel. I've published a few short stories since then, not as many as Usman Malik, but and now I'm working on 2 new novels, and I've written a bunch of other formats like short stories and screenplays, etc. But yeah, my favorite thing on earth that I'm proudest of having done is writing a fantasy fiction novel set in Karachi.
So you said it took you a few months to make it good. This is the skill that comedy teaches you, that all writing is rewriting, which you really learn on the job, unless you go on stage.
Yeah.
Is that something that really helped you?
Definitely. I mean, look, part of it is also like if anyone wants to be a writer, I can't recommend enough Stephen King's On Writing. It is a book that Stephen King wrote. The first half is his autobiography. The second half is an instruction manual on how to write fiction. And it is the most important book if you ever want to be a writer. And he talks about drafts. The first draft, how no matter who you are, no matter how amazing you are, it is going to be a mess. And the freedom to make it a mess as long as you finish it. And that's an important thing. And then the second draft, how you polish that, the third draft. So that was always the thing that stuck with me. And yeah, in stand-up comedy, there's an immediacy that no other art form has, where, I think of an idea now and I go on stage tomorrow and I'll do it on stage. And if it doesn't work, I'll go think about it and go, okay, what if I do that? What if I do that? What if I do that? Go back and try it again the next day. And it works. And now it's done. But it's very rarely do you think of something on the spot and it's perfect the way it comes out. Only Amadeus in the movie, Mozart in the movie Amadeus did that.
Do you compartmentalize deliberately, or does it just happen unconsciously, where you think of an idea and you're like, is this a short story? Is this a bit? Is this an article?
No, sometimes like bits only work as bits. Like if I'm thinking, look, I made a pledge to myself after Islamic Republic of Australia came out, because I wrote an autobiography called I, Migrant. Then I published Boy of Fire and Earth, which is the jinn story. And then I published Islamic Republic of Australia. And I wrote that book, the Islamic Republic of Australia book, in 1 month in a single draft, in 2 drafts. And I was like, this came too easily. And I didn't enjoy writing this at all. It felt too mechanical. And I was like, I don't want to do anything ever again that's autobiographical that isn't in stand-up comedy. That's the only form or art form that I do which gets my story, in which I can tell my story. Anything else needs to be either writing for newspapers or journalism or documentaries or whatever, or fiction. So if it's something that's happened in my life that I want to tell about exactly how it happened, that goes to stand up. If it's an idea for fiction, that's where it gets complicated, because like right now, so a few years ago, I had an idea for a novel. I tried writing it as a novel several times, just didn't work. Couldn't get into it. Wrote 1,000 words, wrote 5,000 words, did another version of 8,000 words, just couldn't get into it. Felt weird. Then I tried writing it as a TV screenplay. Again, didn't work for TV show, right? I tried writing it as a movie screenplay, didn't work as that. And then one day, Amazon, which owns Audible production, which does audiobooks, they contacted me and said, hey, we'd love you to write us something that is, a fiction play of some kind. And do you want to write a comedy? And I was like, I don't want to write a comedy, but I do have an idea for a murder crime noir story that I've been trying to work. And I think it might work in audio format. Then I give it a go. And it just 2-3 weeks, the whole thing came out perfectly, like a couple of drafts and it was done. And I was like, oh, the story was good, but the format wasn't available. And now the format has found itself. So, sometimes you just got to wait for the format to present itself if the story is good enough. So yeah, it's complicated that way.
So you also said, okay, I just couldn't get into it. And historically, I felt really guilty about my creative process because thoda main manic depressive scale par bhi hu. Sometimes I really churn out a lot of content, but then I'm in bed for 3 days after that.
Yeah.
But you also said you're very structured, and Jerry Seinfeld would be like, it's like a 9-to-5 job. Just go and sit and write. Are you one of those, or have you come to the terms with sometimes you need to pour your heart out and then that drains you for 3 days? So give yourself those 3 days to recover.
I'll give myself the 3 days to recover, but those 3 days only happen very rarely. I mean, I'll take weekends off. I never write on the weekends, things like that. But yeah, I've tried to be, because part of it for me is my rent depends on this, man. Like I'm a comedian and a writer full time. Like this is what I do. I have to pay for my daughter's school fees. I have to pay for the computer that she needs for school, for her violin lessons, and I have to pay my rent, and I have to pay the electricity bill, and I have to pay the car insurance. I need the money. And when your rent depends on the writing, the muse is not something you wait around for. And exhaustion afterwards is the way you manage exhaustion from working the same way you manage it if you're a banker. And after you're done with the bank, how do you manage your exhaustion? So that's part of it. Is it's a discipline I've had to develop. So if I'm working on a book, like right now I'm working on a novel on the side, like it's not my main thing that I'm working on. I've got a bunch of different projects going, which bring me regular money. The novel is something, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, who knows? But I know the only thing that matters is I need to finish the first draft. Yeah. I'm 55,000 words in. I have another 30, maybe 40,000 words to go before the first draft is done. It feels like it's a long way away, but if I put in 500 words every day, it'll get done eventually. And so what I do is I literally will take out time to do 500 words. And part of it, sometimes there's a long period where to do those 500 words, I used to go to a bar that I knew near my house, wouldn't drink or anything, but just in the corner, I just liked that environment. So I'd sit there, the guy knew me. As soon as I'd come in, he'd have a cup of coffee for me and he'd have a few slices of orange or whatever. And I'd sit and I'd write for an hour and then I'd leave. But it was a place to go to write. I've lost that because I moved suburbs recently. So now I go and, I go sit in the park after I'm done working out and I'll just write my 500 words. Just making sure I get those in. That's the side thing. The main thing is the, writing for the newspaper column, writing for, other things. That's all a discipline which I got to do because I got deadlines. If I don't meet my deadlines, I don't get invoices paid.
That's the Karachi in you.
Yeah.
Realizing maybe to some people, they're like, wait, you write in a bar? Isn't that loud? And you're like, yeah, that's the Karachi in me. So even me, I prefer writing in places which are loud and things are happening.
Yeah, I can't write in libraries. I've tried libraries. One of the best things I ever discovered, and I don't know if it's a life hack that you can use, but I know it's helped a lot of people, is ambient noise videos on YouTube. Yeah. The one that I'm addicted to is there's a ship on the Arctic ice it's just sitting still and the engine is running and the ice is kind of cracking every now and then and a little bit of rain in the distance. And this is a real sound. Someone recorded 8 hours of just the sound. And I put that in and it's like kind of engine humming that happens. And it blocks out all other sound, so it doesn't distract me, but it creates like a wall of just ambient noise around me. And then I can just focus on the words. It's been really helpful.
So in terms of doing stuff for money and then also focusing on your art, I had Mikal Hassan on. And he had a great point which I've never really thought about. He said कि जब आप gig करते हैं ना, कि आप किसी और का music बजा रहे हैं, आप jingle बजा रहे हैं, it's a muscle. And if you keep using that muscle, it's not like so historically I used to follow Jami's advice which said one for the soul and one for the bread. But then Mikal also had a good point कि अगर आप वही muscle करते रहेंगे, when I started thinking, I was like, yeah, I'm doing a lot of corporate shows and it's fine. I can say what I want to on my own shows and then do corporate shows. But if I keep doing corporate shows, I'm building that muscle and it keeps getting harder to then do shows
do
where
your own
I want to say what I want to say.
Yeah. Look, I think the difference there is Mikal and Jami's financial situations also. Mikal might have more money and less dependence than Jami. Jami is an artist. Mikal is an artist too, by the way. Mikal is a genius and an artist. But for me, Jami is my guy.
Like, I think Mikal and Faraz is a better comparison because...
Yeah. But the thing I will always say, like with stand-up comedy, there's a few rules. Not rules, but a few lessons. When I was very young, when I first started stand-up comedy, I emailed Patton Oswalt. This is back when Patton Oswalt was still not that famous. And he's like an indie comedian. And I emailed
one of the
him
best
through
working
his website.
comedians right now.
Yeah. And I emailed him through his website and I was like, hey, I'm a comedian in Pakistan. I really love your stuff. And, what advice can you give me? And he wrote me back and he said, hey, gig every chance you get. Don't say no to anything. Get on stage anywhere you can, because the only thing that will make you get better is more and more and more stage time. Now, Mikal is right. If you're only doing corporate gigs, you'll become a great corporate gig comedian. but you won't be a great comedian. But because you want to be a great comedian, you'll also keep finding those opportunities as well. Just get up on stage as much as you can, as much as you can, as much as you can. And yeah, if it pays your bills, then you got to do what you got to do, you know. Danish, I don't know, does Danish still do comedy shows? Stand-up?
Danish makes a lot of money from his videos now. So
Okay.
also, I think Danish
But
wrote 40 minutes that he used for a decade, and he never
yeah,
wrote anything after that.
stand-up comedy was never Danish's thing. He was more sketch comedian always. His brain works in sketch, and it was always. But also there is an his sketch comedy, and I don't know how you feel about it. I've always felt was really just pure funny. You know, like it's commercial and it works well commercially, but it's also it's just funny. And it wouldn't work if it wasn't just pure funny. And there's a truth and honesty and achievement and artistry to that.
So, I mean, you've done blackface, so you know all the improv stuff. There's this thing called Crazy Straight. It's either peas in a pod or it's Crazy Straight. I think Danish just has discovered that improv Crazy Straight, and it's every single sketch is Crazy Straight, Crazy Straight, Crazy
Yes.
Straight, Crazy Straight, Crazy Straight. It's the same formula. Once you see it, you're like, okay, I see what's happening. But I think he's comfortable in that pocket. He makes a really good
Yeah.
in those videos, and he's happy doing that. I don't think he's worried about the art as much because he's also quite blatant at ये corporate है, ये मैं बेच रहा हूँ, ये juice बेच रहा हूँ मैं.
I'll tell you one thing though. I remember there was that one. What is his name? Zaid Ali T.
Who also said I have no issues copying videos.
Yeah,
and
like, the reason why the whole bullshit, like why that guy got caught out as a plagiarist was because Danish was the one who kind of brought it to attention. I remember, or at least that's the when I saw it.
Saad did a show with Zaid Ali where Zaid did somebody else's material and Saad was like, bro.
Yeah.
But I remember it bugged Danish a lot as well. So I think, like, you know, part of it is like the other thing you have to keep in mind with comedy is like handwriting. You don't get to choose it. You know, you can try, you don't get to choose what material comes out of your brain. You can try to be funnier. You can try to do the thing of like, I will do a Seinfeldian approach to comedy, or I will talk the way, you know, Bill Burr talks, or Dave Chappelle, or whatever. Comedy is based on your life experiences, your observations, your whatever. It is as true to you as your handwriting. And so the good comedy out there, if you're doing the good comedy, which I know for sure you are, it's going to be your comedy and no one else can do it.
Yeah, except in Danish's case, his comedy is based on the experiences of a lot of young comedians in this. Let's just say that and stop at Danish.
Okay, look, he's an very old friend of mine. I still will defend him, but I'm also not up to date on the goss.
No, he's welcome to come on the podcast because काफी हमारे discussions हैं करने वाले Danish के साथ. So let's not talk about people who aren't here. But thanks, Sami. I think this was great talking to you. And
yeah, absolutely. I had a great time. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one.
I was like, no one's gonna ask him questions.
No, a lot of people remember. Like, I mean, I even remember Ishma Alvi because we did a show for TV1 back in the day. You have no idea who remembers what you did when you did.
Yeah, dude, that's part of it as well.
Yeah, sometimes people come up to me and they're like, you know, the video you did 10 years ago. I was like, people saw that had like 37 views. You were one of those 37.
I met someone recently, like here in Australia, who's a migrant here, and she was like, I saw your show in Kuch Khas in Islamabad in 2009, and I was like, man, and she's like, and you did this joke, and I was like, I don't even remember any of that. I remember being in Kuch Khas, but like, I don't remember the joke. But that's crazy, like people still remember random things like that. Yeah. Honestly, I wish I would come back. I don't even know if it's still safe for me to come back, but if it is, I'd love to come back and perform again. I miss being in Karachi and doing comedy for Karachiites. I miss that soulful laugh.
So, in terms of just being a voice, you don't even talk a lot about Pakistan or Pakistani issues online, at least, or you don't put out content. Is that a deliberate?
No, I don't. Yeah, well, part of it is one of it. When I was in Pakistan, one of the things that always annoyed me was there was expats who were telling Pakistanis how to live their life. It always annoyed me, and I was like, I'm never going to be that. I'm never going to be the guy who moved abroad has a totally different life and is sitting abroad going, Pakistanis should be doing this and Pakistanis are bad at that. It's like, dude, shut the fuck up. Like, you don't have a right anymore. You've given up that.
Or as we call them now, PTI supporters.
Huh. That's a good one. But so that's been a part of it as well. And the other part is like I can't keep up. Like the scandals and the story. My parents were here a few years ago on holiday. They were here for like a month. And my dad, obviously, as soon as he lands, he's like, Jio on karo or ARY on karo. So I had to tune in all that shit to my TV. And the only time I had those on. And the scandal at the time was some politician, I can't even remember who, a bottle of scotch was found in his hotel room or a hospital room. And then he said it's not scotch.
Hospital, shahad hai, honey.
And I was like, man, how can I keep up with this?
Man.
Who's gonna keep? I can't keep track of, like, Australia's got enough things going on. I'm a journalist. I'm a political journalist, satirist, everything. I need to keep track of this. I can't keep up with Pakistani politics. It's too bananas, So that was part of it as well. And then the other thing is, with each passing year, I'm further away from that place. It's still my home. It's 35 years of my identity, and the rest of my life, I'll always be a Pakistani. But I just feel less and less like I know what's going on. Like the Karachi I visit now, half the things that I know won't be there. I recently heard that Abdullah Shah Ghazi's mazar, the view to the mazar is blocked now and has been blocked for a few years now by some towers. Yeah, I don't even know what that is. I have never, and I'm like, that's such a crazy thing to me, because that view was unblocked for decades, and in literally a few years it's gone now. So the respect for the mazar is changed, and so it's stuff like that where I'm like, okay, it's not my Pakistan. It's not my place to tell people how to live in that Pakistan. And if I go back there now, I'll be a tourist. I'll just be a tourist who knows where some of the good stuff still is, but I'll still be a tourist. And
where's
it's sad, but that is what it is.
Where do you get it? Where do you get the best stuff? Al-Fakhir Shisha is probably where you used to be if you used to live in Muhammad Ali, because that was the place to be when I was young.
Yeah. No, we used to go to we were dorks, man. We used to go to Park Medico in Jammu, pick up our comic books, X-Men and Hulk and everything. Then we'd go to Sir Akhtar's maths tuition class on the way to I can't remember. Ideal Bake. Basically, Ideal Bakery was on one side, and behind Ideal Bakery was the Ideal Dhaba, where we'd go and sit and have chai, and then behind that was Sir Akhtar's maths tuitions. And that was my life, man. That was probably the last time my life was simple and easy and uncomplicated and not getting into trouble.
And this is the 80s, when I'm assuming you're growing up in Karachi.
Late 80s, early 90s. Yeah, I'm 42 now. I was born in 1978.
So there's a lot of this romanticization of the past as well, but you're growing up in Zia's era. But a lot of times people are like, itne better tha, people pretend that 70s mein to pata nahi kya night clubs chal rahe the or belly dances. And I was like, yeah, maybe some of that happened, but that was an everyday life for every single person in Karachi. So itna bhi romanticize nahi karna chahiye.
I know. Yeah, it was a very privileged life for the few, and same the misery of the masses. But I grew up in the Zia era. I remember when Zia died, and in 1987, was it? Or 89?
Or 88, one of the two.
Right. And I remember that, and then we were going to have elections. That was a mind-blowing thing for me, because I was like, wait, you can change the president? Like, it doesn't have to be the same guy forever and ever and ever. Like, I remember having that realization, going, what does that mean? Then, the Benazir, then Nawaz Sharif, then Benazir, then Nawaz Sharif, then Musharaf, and then, then everything that's followed since then. For me, I'm of that generation, which unfortunately, for us, the best time in Pakistan in terms of growth and prosperity and all of those things was the first few years of the Musharaf era, which we know now was a massive illusion based off of war on terror money and the disappearance of the Balochis and all of those things. But And but I was in America in 2001, and my friends, when I graduated in 2002, like mid 2002, my friends in Pakistan called me up and said, dude, they're opening music channels here, there's like 24 news channels, you got to get back here. And I got back right away, and Indus Music was on, and MTV was on, and Geo had just launched, and I was like, I want to be a part of this stuff. Like, this is what I want to do. So that was the golden era for us, and then that turned into hell really fast.
But it's I'm so glad that you said illusion, because there's a lot of these middle class Pakistanis who now support Imran Khan who are like, Musharaf times was great. Yeah, it was great for you. It wasn't great for everybody. It wasn't
wasn't
great
great.
for the people going missing.
If it was great, it would still be great. It wasn't just great in any sustainable way, and that's the lesson we learned. Look, there was there was stuff that was worth holding on to. For example, we forget that Junoon as a band was literally not allowed to perform until Musharaf lifted that law banning them from performing. PTV and NTM were all we had until he said, yeah, you can have any private license can have TV channels. Now, does that mean that, yes, army people made a lot of money off the sales of TV channel licenses and all of that stuff? Of course. 90% of every rupee earned in Pakistan goes to an army guy's pocket. That's just the way that nature of the beast is. But yes, there were some things that were good for the country. However, they were not put in with thought, they were not put in with consideration, and they were not put in with sustainability in mind. And that's why things are the way they are now.
It's also that, for instance, if China makes a music video about the Belt and Road Initiative with children, you're like, wow, this is great content. Yeah, but what are they trying to hide? So while Musharraf is talking about enlightened moderation, but his political allies are Sipai Sahaba, where his political allies are good Taliban, you're like, ये थोड़ा illusion है कि yes, it's great कि आपने concert करा दिया. I grew up in that generation where Aro, Noori, EP were doing live gigs. I went to a concert with Junoon, Mizrab, Mizmar, Faraz, Mikal, Karwan, Noori, all played. And I was like, this is the greatest night of my life. I got 8 hours of rock music.
Yeah. That's we used to go to, gigs and jam sessions, and I like one of my favorite stand-up shows when I was first starting out that I remember was it was Aro, it was Ali Azmat doing when his solo album just come out, and it was like a whole bunch of different guys. Noori was in town when Gumby was still drumming for them, and I was emceeing doing stand-up, and it was like all the students in Indus Valley, just crazy energy, mad like passion and beauty, and men and women and everyone more together in the crowd and all that stuff. But at the same time, drone attacks were happening, kidnappings were happening, disappearances were happening, and all that stuff. So it's only in retrospect that you can look back on a lot of that stuff. And look, I'll probably become an old man, an old uncle. I'm already in uncle phase. Well, I'm in uncle phase, right? I'm Gen X, but I'm still going to be in uncle phase soon because I'm 42, I've got the white beard, and it's going to be a thing where I'll say things, 20 years from now, where I'll be like, Pakistan was only great in 1988 to 2002. After that, it was all shit, and I'll only listen to music that existed when I was young, and everything else is terrible. And that's what happens to expats, and I'll do the same horrific thing.
But even we don't do the math right? Even we talk about Musharraf's economy. Well, how much did we lose in terrorism? How much did we lose in terms of potential foreign investment? अगर आप foreign investment की बात कर रहे हैं, because of terrorism.
When I started working in journalism, then I left journalism for a little while to work in advertising. And when I was working in advertising during the Musharraf era, one of the last projects that I did while working at advertising in an ad agency before going back to journalism was the start of the tourism campaign, because Pakistan was going so great. We had so much money coming in, and we had such a progressive image. Musharraf had just gone and done Jon Stewart's show in New York and the Daily Show and all that. That we were like, dude, it's going to be tourist heaven now. The golden era is back. It's going to be like the time when Herbie Hancock and Che Guevara all hung out, say linked arms on boat basin or whatever. And I went and had a meeting with the Prime Minister as part of an advertising team, who said, pitch Pakistan as a tourism destination to the New York Times, and we made the whole ad campaign. And I got poached by an ad, but I hated advertising, so I got poached by a news channel, Dawn News at the time. I started working for them, and before that ad campaign could roll out the next year, the terrorism started. And we were like, oh yeah, that's over. So that shows it wasn't sustainable. It was all poorly thought out.
At this point, जो दो लोग सुन रहे थे वो भी ट्यून आउट कर चुके हैं और ये पर्सनल कॉन्वर्सेशन हो चुकी है, तो मैं फिर ये भी पूछ ही लूं. Did you ever think about, so you asked about the comedy scene 6 hours ago when we started. So
yeah.
It's really changed, and I think maybe this was just me being that young rebellious kid where I was like, it's great that Saad and Sami, people do these shows, but it's not really creating a community around, right? So then when we started, we deliberately made a choice कि यार हम mad school करेंगे, T2F करेंगे, और हर show पे 5-6 नए comedians आएंगे जिसको करना है, that open mic culture. Do you ever look back?
Saad used to do that. Saad was very, very good at that. I'll always give Saad credit. He created Blackfish, which was a community thing. And then the first open mics at T2F, before anyone else anywhere had open mics, Saad used to run them. Before T2F was in T2F, there's a brief period
when it was actually T2F.
Well, first it used to be called the second floor, and it was
on the second floor.
Exactly, and it was a tiny place. And I remember Sabine and Zach said, "Hey, we're setting up this place," and I was like, "Good luck with that. Sounds like a nightmare." And Saad set up an open mic, and he ran an open. He liked creating things for communities. And that was always something Saad was really good at. So he did that. There was a lot of people who never went on to do comedy long term, but who were there at the open mics and who read poetry or did stand-up or played music. And a lot of that stuff used to happen. I remember Zoe Vickerji used to be very young. She was a kid and she'd come and play the guitar and sing songs at the open mics.
Also, Rachel had a band, Rachel's Plan B, which used to do a lot of
stuff. That's right. And so that was like, I'm not good at that. I'm solo, man. I'm not good at community stuff. I'm not good at, like, when I perform, I like doing stand-up because solo. When I write, I like writing my books because I write them alone. I'm a solitary person, and it's one of those things. Like, I like mentoring. I like mentoring a lot. So like in Australia, for example, there's a lot of like Pakistani and Indian students, university students who study journalism who I mentor because they want to learn how to be journalists in Australia. So I teach them that. Or in comedy, I mean, there's a woman here doing comedy these days who's Pakistani. And so I'm meeting her in a few days to like help her with just career advice, things like that. That's something I enjoy doing. Just being able to sit with people and say, hey, try this. I've done this long enough to know what works, what doesn't work. This is what you can do differently. The fact that you all are now creating stuff that is sustainable, that will help other new people have spaces where they can explore, where they can fail. What you need is a place for people to fail, not to succeed. And that's the beautiful thing about a good open mic. So if that's what you're creating, that's more power to you guys. I was never good at it.
And T2F was doing open mics. Absolutely, you're right. Saad used to MC those, but they weren't comedy open mics. That comedy open mic.
No, they weren't. They were mixed.
Yeah,
they were anything.
So if you want to be a comic, so like for instance, right now they're probably, well, none of them are probably doing it full time, but there are probably 100 people who are doing stand-up comedy at least once a month.
Really?
Yes. And there's
amazing.
There are at least a couple of stand-up comedy shows every single week. There was a time where we hit a high where there were about like 10 comedy shows every single week. There were times when there were 3 comedy nights every single night, every single Friday at least, because that's the most popular day here. And we'd hit that high, but usme fir masla ye hua tha, everybody jumped in. So there were comedy open mic nights which were being produced by people who weren't great, and it was a fledgling industry. So people didn't think, acha, Shahzad ka show bura hai, Akbar ka show bura hai, Natalia ka show bura hai. They're like, we went to a stand-up comedy show in Karachi and it wasn't good. So now we will never go to a stand-up comedy show.
Yeah, to be fair, that happens in Australia still. That happens in America still as well. There's people who'll go to one and they'll be like, well, all of stand-up comedy is bad. So that's just part of the risk as well. It's not a mainstream art form. We think it is because it's on Netflix and all of that stuff, but it isn't. In the end, stand-up comedy is an underground. It's a low art. You know, there's the low arts and the high arts. It's a low art. But that's why I love it. I mean, like the India scene's amazing, but they've got the comedy clubs, and I know Aditya Mittal and I know Karunish really well. Karunish Talwar, and they're both amazing. And
he's my favorite Indian comedian. I love him.
Karunish is one of my top 10 comedians of all time right now. Like, he's brilliant as a writer, as a performer, everything. And, I was talking about the industry, and the main thing that helped there was money. Money sets, some people with money decided to set up comedy clubs and keep them open no matter what. The bad shows, the good shows. You're going to have the rise, you're going to have the fall, you're going to have the rise back, slow rise back again. If someone's willing to keep a comedy club open like that, and there's, comedy every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. There's comedy. Thursday's open mic night, Friday's a regular paid night with good dinner and comedy, Saturday dinner and comedy. Every week for the next 5 years, if someone's willing to take that financial risk, you'll have an amazing comedy scene build up around it to sustain it. And that's what it takes. But yeah, it takes a risk for someone to do.
Yeah, it's the same thing in America. People like Mitzi Shore, Comedy Store.
Exactly.
Greenwich Comedy Club, Cellar. There are people who were like, we just want a space for deviants to come at night and feel like, hum belong karte hain kahin na kahin.
No, I mean, honestly, like I did my 2 gigs today. I had two, one in the evening, early evening, one late evening. And if I didn't have the podcast with you right now, I'd probably just be out with a bunch of comedians just eating pizza and talking. Tomorrow night, I've got another gig. And the gig finishes at 9 p.m. I'm done at 9 p.m. I'll be out till like 11 o'clock at night because it's just one of those things of like, I just want to hang out with other weirdos. And, we're all prepping for the Melbourne Comedy Festival. That starts next week anyway. So we're all super nervous about our shows. And it's just good to bounce dumb things off of each other's brains.
I think though bhi Pakistan mein ek struggle hai ke they're probably like me and Akbar are the 2 full-time working stand-up comedians probably in the entire country. We're the only people we can talk to, right? So if I have a show on Friday and during the week people are like, can we meet? And I'm like, no, I'm sitting in front of a laptop. They're like, what the fuck? Just come out for an hour. I'm like, no, it's that zone thing you miss out on. And then you do a show and they're like, now I'm free to meet. And people are like, bro, it's 11 p.m. on a Friday. We have children and we have jobs tomorrow because people work here as well. Yeah. And then you're like, I don't have people I can relate to who live the life I live.
Literally, everything you're describing, from the Taliban harassing you to
Sami's like, so nothing's changed in Karachi. I'm glad to know, kids. Everything's still the
same. It's literally the first few years of my comedy career. It's everything. It's me sitting at home listening to podcasts about comedians performing abroad, because podcasting was new then as well. It had just kind of come out. And going, I wonder what that must be like. I wonder what it must be like hang out with other comedians and talk to other comedians. And the only other comedians in the city that I knew were Danish and Saad, and we used to get along well. We're really good friends, all 3 of us. But also we weren't like, we'd see each other once every few months at gigs. And that was about it, a corporate gig or something. And that was about it. It's just, it's a solitary art form. So it's good to find a community where you can. And that'll be a really good thing.
I think that's part of the reason we built the community. They're like,
and that's a smart thing to do.
Yeah, and also get different voices. Like, there are a lot of women who are doing stand-up comedy now, which is phenomenal.
I remember there was a bunch of girls who had started doing stand-up comedy a few years ago, and they got in touch with me and said, hey, can you give us advice? And I said, better than me would be like Aditya. She's more probably qualified to give you advice on how to be a woman in comedy than for my nonsense. And I got them in touch with Aditya, and she really helped them out a lot. I can't remember the names though now.
Was it a few years ago. Or Aurat Nak?
Aurat Nak, that was
it. Aurat Nak is a comedy collective of women.
Yeah. Great. That's awesome. That is so great.
Yeah. And that's right up. That's right up Aditya Mittal's alley also, because it's a lot of this like. Well, Pakistan में तो provocative हो जाता है, but it's a lot of like articulating your experience as a woman and to Amazing, Sami. Thank you so much for doing this. Hope I've managed to substitute your weirdo R by being a weirdo myself.
Man, this has been so much fun.
I hope there was pizza involved, but next time pizza shizza leke podcast karenge. But thank you so much.
Next time pizza leke. Anytime, man. Honestly, anytime. This was lots of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Awesome. And thank you everybody for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.